Chapter 20 of Five Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Allison. Five Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. The Cooking Club. "Oh, my goodness me!" Alexia gave a jump, then ran for the closet. "Dear me!" exclaimed Polly, standing quite still in the middle of the room, the lightning flash and the sudden peal of thunder coming without warning. "Oh, I'm scared to death!" cried Alexia, burrowing frantically. "Come in here, Polly Pepper. Are you killed?" she screamed. "No," said Polly, "and I don't believe there'll be another as bad." "Oh, come in here! Oh!" cried Alexia in muffled accents, as she huddled up against the clothes. "Oh, Polly!" It was Miss Rice. Her embroidery, cast aside at the sudden storm burst, was dragging behind her, and she was wringing her hands. "Did you ever see anything so dreadful?" "I don't believe there'll be another as bad," said Polly again, finding nothing more of consolation to offer. "And where is Alexia?" And without waiting for an answer, Miss Rice paced nervously up and down the room, still wringing her hands. "And of course there will be more. There it comes!" And she ran, the embroidery piece still hanging to her gown, into the closet. "Oh, Aunt!" cried Alexia with a squeal. "You scared me most to death. I thought I was struck." "Why, are you here, Alexia?" gasped Miss Rice, when she could recover herself enough to speak. "Well, this is truly a dreadful storm," and she clutched her with shaking fingers. "Yes, I am here," said Alexia. "Don't pinch so, Aunt. Ow! My arm is all black and blue, I know it is." "It's no time to think of such little things, Alexia," replied her aunt severely. "It may kill us both." "Well, that's no reason I should be all pinched to death," grumbled Alexia, forgetting the thunderstorm and her present discomfort, and edging off as well as she could. "The closet is dreadfully small, Aunt." "It's quite large enough, I'm sure, to protect us," said Miss Rice, hanging tightly to her with trembling fingers. "Dear me, any minute may be our last." "Well, I'm not going to be smothered to death," declared Alexia, struggling to work her way past her aunt. "Alexia!" exclaimed her aunt. "I'm going after Polly." Alexia, out in the middle of the room, flung her arm around Polly. "Oh, misery! Where?" as a vivid flash seemed to hop right in the window. "Oh, Polly, come!" She clutched her wildly. "Where?" said Polly. "We can't get away from it, Alexia. It's just everywhere." "Oh, I don't care. Anywhere. In the coal scoop," cried Alexia, frantically dragging her along. "I shall just die, Polly Pepper, and here you stand like a stick." "Well, there's just no use in running," said Polly, but seeing Alexia's distress, she suffered herself to be led, and downstairs the two girls sped, and into the landlady's room, the first door to stand ajar. "I'm coming in," announced Alexia without ceremony, "for I'm scared to death," and she dragged Polly Pepper after her. "Did you ever see such a thunderstorm, Mrs. Cummings?" "It is pretty bad," a voice answered. It wasn't Mrs. Cummings, as she had hurried to oversee the maid close the windows through the house, but another of the boarders who, like Alexia, had selected this apartment for a refuge. "Oh, dear me!" Alexia sank down upon the sofa, being careful not to relinquish her hold of Polly, and dragged a cushion over her face. "Is that you, Mr. Filbert?" bringing out one eye to stare at him. "I think so," said Mr. Filbert, a little thin old man sitting over in the corner and leaning forward over his cane. He spoke cautiously, as if not quite sure. "Yes, it is a bad storm," he repeated decidedly. "Where is your aunt?" "She's up in the closet," said Alexia, pulling the sofa cushion over her own and Polly's face as well. "There, we can't see it at any rate, if we are going to be killed." "Up in the closet?" repeated Mr. Filbert. "Yes. Oh, Polly, do you suppose it's lightning and thundering now?" as the two girls cuddled up closer together on the roomy old sofa, the cushion crowded up over eyes and ears. "I suppose so," said Polly, very much wishing she could say no. "Oh, dear me, I'm smothered to death," grumbled Alexia, "and I'm so hot," wriggling discontentedly. "So am I," said Polly. "What did you say? Your aunt was in the closet?" little old Mr. Filbert was asking, and receiving no reply, he kept on. "Oh, do hear him," whispered Alexia back of the sofa cushion. "He is so tiresome, asking the same thing over and over." "Well, do answer him," said Polly. "I have once," said Alexia. "Is your aunt in the closet, did you say?" Mr. Filbert kept on, with the impression that a reply would soon be coming if he only held up the conversation at his end of it. Alexia dashed down the sofa cushion with a nervous hand. "I can't breathe. Let's get out, Polly," and she flew up to sit quite straight. "Yes, my aunt is up in the closet, Mr. Filbert. Whee! Oh, I am so scared, Polly Pepper." "She'll be struck there quicker'n any other place she could pick out," declared the little old gentleman positively. Alexia hopped off from the sofa and ran on anxious feet to his chair. "What did John say, Mr. Filbert? And how do you know?" she cried, all in one breath. "The chimney closets always catch the lightning first," said Mr. Filbert cheerfully. "You see, it—" Alexia dashed off, ran through the hall, and up to her own room. "Aunt, Aunt!" she cried, thrusting her head into the closet. "You'll be struck in there. Mr. Filbert says so. Come out, Aunt." There was no response, and Alexia, now in mortal terror, plunged into the closet. "Come, Aunt! Oh, my!" as a clap of thunder sent her plunging in headlong. Why, where— For grope as she might, clear up to the end, among the clothes and the shoe bag, no Miss Rice was to be found. "Oh, dear, dear!" Alexia began to whimper, feeling all around the floor with terror-stricken fingers. "Aunt, where are you? Oh, she's been struck and she's dead. I know she is. Polly Pepper!" she screamed, tumbling out of the closet to rush to the head of the stairs. "Come up and help me find Aunt." "Alexia!" Miss Rice, concluding not to be left alone in the closet when the two girls ran downstairs, had hurried out after them, and now appeared from the hall corner where she had crouched. "Don't scream so!" "Oh, Aunt!" cried Alexia, throwing her arms around her. "You haven't been struck, have you? Oh, do say you haven't!" "Why, of course not. Don't you see I'm here?" said Miss Rice. "There, child, take care. You're mussing my lace collar." And she edged off from the nervous fingers. "We'll go downstairs, I think, and stay with Mrs. Cummings." "If you're really sure you are not struck," said Alexia, eyeing her askance, as if in considerable doubt, "we'll go. And Polly Pepper is there, and that tiresome old Mr. Filbert." "If Polly is there, she must stay to luncheon," said Miss Rice, gathering up her skirts and preparing to descend the stairs. "Oh, how fine!" exclaimed Alexia, hopping after, losing sight of the thunderstorm in the delight of having Polly Pepper to herself for so many hours. "Oh, Aunt, what's that tagging after you?" catching sight of the piece of embroidery dangling from her aunt's long figure. "I see nothing," said Miss Rice, turning around with her head over her shoulder. "Well, do stand still, Aunt," cried Alexia. "A minute." "What is it?" Miss Rice kept saying, trying to see for herself. "Your centerpiece! Oh, dear me!" Alexia by this time had it free, and burst into a laugh as she held it up. "Well, now I expect I have dragged off my green floss!" exclaimed her aunt in irritation. "I am quite sure of it." "Well, 'twould be in the closet," said Alexia, who didn't relish offering to go back. "'Twon't hurt it to stay there a little while." "I must find it," said Miss Rice decidedly, and Alexia, wild to go down to tell Polly Pepper she was to stay to luncheon, flew over the stairs, leaving her aunt to get her green floss as she could. "But I can't," said Polly, when Alexia had hugged her and danced around her to her heart's content. "I must go home." "Why, Polly Pepper? You can't ever go in this awful rain." "It isn't going to rain much more," said Polly, running over to the window to flatten her face against the pane. "You'll be struck if you do that." Little Mr. Filbert looked after her in disapproval. "The window is the worst place in a thunderstorm. You see, it—" "Oh, that's what you said about the chimney closet," said Alexia in scorn. "And there can't be two places that are the worst." "Oh, Alexia," said Polly, looking back from the window. "Well, he's so tiresome," said Alexia, putting her arm around her and gazing out of the window. "That's just the way he goes on at the table every single day. Oh, see it rain, Polly Pepper!" "It's slackening," said Polly, peering up at the drops, that really were beginning to fall with little spaces between. "And Mamsie will send for me soon, I guess." "Oh, well, it will begin again most likely," said Alexia. "I hope this thunderstorm will last till ever so late this afternoon." "Oh, Alexia Rice!" cried Polly in great distress, and whirling away from the window. "Don't wish that. Why, I must get home." "Well, I do," said Alexia, bobbing her light hair till the fluff settled over her forehead. "For then you'd stay. You haven't been over here in ever and ever so long, Polly Pepper," she said, in an injured voice, "and I've got so very much to talk with you about." "Well, let's talk now then," said Polly, with a sigh, yet feeling quite sure that she would soon be sent for to go home. "Come over to the sofa then," said Alexia. So they ran over, and together settled as far back into the corner as they could, pushing up one of the cushions comfortably behind them. "Well, now you begin," said Polly. "Oh, no, you," said Alexia, having no notion of doing the talking, for it was always great fun to listen to Polly Pepper. "Why, I thought you said you had ever so much to talk over," said Polly. "So I have," said Alexia coolly. "We always do have. You know we do, Polly. Well, now begin." "But it's your place to begin first," said Polly decidedly, "because you said you had something to talk over. So what is it, Alexia?" "Well," Alexia drew a long breath, cudgelling her brains, then burst out, "we must think of something new to do now, Polly, since the garden party is over." "I know," said Polly. "How I wish we could get up something else, for our fancy work is all done. Oh, wasn't it just gorgeous, Alexia?" with a comfortable little wriggle. "I should say it was," cried Alexia. "And didn't it sell, though? And everybody wished there was more, except my horrible old shawl." "Why, Alexia Rice!" Polly poked up her head where she had been nestling it on Alexia's shoulder. "You know Mrs. Sterling sent for the shawl and gave $5 for it." "Oh, that was because she knew it was so ugly that no one else would buy it," said Alexia composedly. "Well, I don't care, so long as it's sold. I was just tired to death of that old thing, Polly. I don't want to ever see another shawl." "Well, we shan't have another fair in a long while, I suppose," said Polly with a sigh, and laying her head down again. "Not till next summer," said Alexia. "Then, says I, for a garden party. You know your grandpapa said he'd give you another, just as nice a one then." "But that's a whole year," said Polly disconsolately. "Hi-ho, it's so very long to wait. Well, I suppose we must think of something else to do now." "Just for us girls," said Alexia. "I don't know," said Polly slowly, looking up at her. "We ought to let the boys come in." "Oh, not those horrid boys," said Alexia impatiently. "They're forever hanging around, and I like, once in a while, to have something by ourselves." "But it seems too bad to leave them out," said Polly soberly. "Well, it would do them good to be left out sometimes," declared Alexia. "They're so high and mighty. I'd just dearly love to take them down and say, 'Boys, you can't come into this.'" She tossed her fluffy hair till the long, light braids flew out triumphantly. "Why can't we have a cooking club?" suggested Polly, after a minute of hard thinking. "Ugh!" Alexia twisted up her face. "Oh, that's horrid," she said, with another grimace. "Do you mean learn to make things on the kitchen range?" "Yes, and on the chafing dish," said Polly, flying up to sit straight. "Oh, it would be elegant, Alexia," she cried, with glowing cheeks. "Well, I can't learn," said Alexia, "so that's some small comfort, for I'm in a boarding house, and I guess the cook here would fly in a fit to see me come into the kitchen." "But you can come to our house and learn with me," said Polly, clasping her hands, "and we'll make perfectly splendid things. Just think, Alexia." "What things?" asked Alexia doubtfully. "Oh, little biscuits," said Polly, going back in her mind to the delights of baking day in the little brown house. "Cunning little ones, you know. You can't think how perfectly elegant we used to make them, Alexia." "Oh, you had everything elegant in your little brown house," said Alexia, twisting enviously in her corner. "Joel's never tired of telling it. And to think I wasn't there! Oh, dear me, I wish you would talk about it." "Well, you can try now to make some biscuits. I'll show you how," said Polly eagerly. "And Polly, oh, goody! Now don't you see we won't have to ask the boys to join this? A cooking club! The very idea!" Alexia hopped off from the sofa and stood in front of Polly, clasping her hands. "Why, yes, we will," cried Polly, hopping off too, and speaking very decidedly. "The boys will like it just as much as we do." "The boys like a cooking club!" screamed Alexia, standing quite still. "Yes, indeed," said Polly. "Why, Jasper used to like our baking days in the little brown house. You know he did, Alexia, like everything." "Oh, dear, yes, I know," said Alexia reluctantly. "And beside, even if they don't make things, why, they can come to our suppers, for we must of course get up some, of things we've learned to make. Oh, it will be such fun, Alexia." Polly sighed and clasped her hands. "And I'll learn to make your cunning little biscuits," declared Alexia suddenly, quite as if she had proposed the plan and pushed it along from the very beginning. "And do let's have a club supper soon," she begged. "There's a carriage coming," announced little Mr. Filbert from his chair in the corner. "Oh, it's for me, I know," cried Polly, springing to the window. "Yes, Mamsie has sent for me, Alexia. I knew she would." "Oh, dear me," grumbled Alexia, awfully disappointed and racing after her. "Why, you can't ever go in all this rain, Polly Pepper." Polly burst out into a laugh. "Just look there," she pointed to the patches of light in the sky, gradually growing bigger and brighter. "It doesn't rain a single drop. And oh, Alexia, look, look, the rainbow." End of chapter 20.
Chapter number 21 of Five Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by A.C. Benson. Five Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. Of many things in general. But the cooking club, with all its delights, wasn't started yet for many a day, for just as soon as Polly got home there was the whole story of the morning's adventures of Joel and Larry's accident to fill all her time and thoughts. And then Jack, why, of course, he must come in for a goodly share of notice, for Joel insisted on making him a hero, to be willing to come and tell Mr. King of his misdemeanor on the pond. And Dr. Fisher had said the arm was in a bad way, the trouble being increased by all the running about in the pelting storm that Jack had indulged in, and this made Joel nearly frantic. Dear me, there was no time to think of cooking clubs. And then after luncheon came a little note from Mrs. Sterling, brought by no less a person than Mrs. Gibson herself, who, in her staid little black bonnet and gray dress and white apron, waited for Polly's answer. "No, miss, I'll not sit down, if you please, as my mistress expects me back at once." "Dear Polly," so the note ran, "will you run down this afternoon to talk over a little plan for the Comfort Committee? I suppose the boys have told you about it. Bring Joel, too, for he couldn't come this morning when it was proposed. Your friend, Pamela Sterling." "Oh, goody!" exclaimed Polly, vastly pleased, and springing off. "Yes, I'll come, Mrs. Gibson. Please tell her, and right away. That is, when I find Joel." "I hope you'll be there soon," said Mrs. Gibson, the light of pleasure at Polly's first words dying down a bit when she saw that Joel was to be waited for. "Couldn't you come first?" she asked anxiously. "Oh, I must find Joel," said Polly, "but I almost know where he is, and will be over soon. Please tell her so." She was already out in the hall, and Mrs. Gibson, having obtained the best she was likely to receive, departed to carry back the word to her mistress. And Polly raced here and there without avail, for Joel was not so easily found after all. "Oh, Joel, where are you?" cried Polly, racing along the hall. "Oh, dear me! Percy, is that you?" as Percy, with Van at his heels, came near running into her. "Yes, it is," said Percy, coming to an abrupt stop, but Van ran past them. "Hold on, Van," he cried, his face growing very red. "That's not fair, when Polly wanted to speak to us." "She didn't want to speak to me," said Van, making pretty quick time down the hall. "Oh, Polly, make him stop," begged Percy, twitching her sleeve. "He's going up into Ben's room. It's not fair, for I was ahead." "Well, you aren't ahead now," cried Van in glee, and mounting the stairs, he couldn't resist the temptation to peer over the railing. "Ha ha! Who's the smart one now? I'll get there first, Percy Whitney." "You shan't. Oh, make him stop!" howled Percy in distress. "Van," called Polly, looking up at him. "What?" said Van, wishing he hadn't wasted the time in exhibiting his triumph. He still kept on. "I want you," said Polly clearly. "Come down, Vanny. That's a good boy." "What do you want me for?" asked Van, turning slowly to look down at her. "Come down and you'll see. Make haste, Van, for I'm in a dreadful hurry." "What do you want me for?" repeated Van, begrudging every step of the way he was now taking and keeping a sharp lookout that Percy didn't spring past him. To prevent that, he spread out both arms. "Say, Polly, what do you want me for?" At last he was by her side. "There, who's going to get up in Ben's room first?" said Percy complacently. "Well, you aren't," said Van stoutly, "'cause just as soon as Polly's got through with me, I'm going to run like lightning up there. So, I was ahead when she called me back." "Well, I was ahead first," declared Percy. "Wasn't I, Polly? Wasn't I?" he appealed anxiously to her. "Yes," said Polly, "and hush, Van. Now see here, boys, I've got to find Joel. Mrs. Sterling has sent for him to come with me over there this afternoon, and she wants us right away. Don't you know where he is? I've looked for him just everywhere." She clasped her hands and looked at them in despair. "I don't," said Percy. "Neither do I," said Van. "We're going up in Ben's room. Is that all, Polly?" And he prepared to run. "No," said Polly, while Percy, in alarm lest a march should be stolen on him, sidled off on the other side. "Van!" Polly nipped his jacket and held it fast. Seeing which, Percy concluded to remain, and he now came back quietly and stood quite still. "Boys," said Polly, "it's just this way. You must help me find Joel, for unless you do, I'm sure I don't know what I can do. And Mrs. Sterling was going to tell us all about the Comfort Committee to help Larry, you know." She dropped Van's jacket end and ran and sat down on one of the high-backed chairs and folded her hands in dismay. "Oh, we will," cried both of the boys, quite overcome at this, and, losing sight of all the charms that were awaiting them in Ben's room, they precipitated themselves upon her. "But where shall we look for him? You know he went out with Dr. Fisher in his gig. Say where we shall look for him, Polly." "Joel went out with Papa Fisher," cried Polly, hopping off from her chair. "Why didn't you say so before? Oh, dear me." "Well, you asked me where he was, and I didn't know where they were going," said Percy dismally, changing from one foot to the other in great distress. "And they might have taken us. I think it was real mean," declared Van in a dudgeon. "Oh, Van, if he went with Papa Fisher, how could he?" "Oh, I know." Polly clasped her hands. "They've gone down to see that boy that got his arm hurt on the pond. I verily believe they have." Well, they might have taken us, said Van again. I'd like to have seen him awfully, and now Joel will have him all to himself. I'm going to get something, and I won't let Joel have any of it, he added vindictively. Oh, Vanny, and Polly went close to him and put her cheek to his. Just think what a dreadful time Joel had out there on the pond, and she gave a little shiver. Ha ha, ejaculated Percy. You'd been scared to death, Van, if those boys even winked at you. I wouldn't either, declared Van, straightening up. Percy, said Polly warningly, turning around at him. Well, he would, said Percy uneasily, not looking at her. You know he would, Polly. Well, don't say any such thing, said Polly firmly, and perhaps he wouldn't either. No, I wouldn't, protested Van stoutly, since Polly reinforced him, and you're just as mean as you can be, Percy Whitney, to say so. Boys, Polly drew away from Van and sank down on her chair again. I shan't have anything to say to either of you when you say such dreadful things, and she folded her hands sorrowfully in her lap and looked straight ahead at the opposite wall. Oh, we won't, cried both boys, running over to her. Polly, we won't, shaking her arms. Well, don't then, said Polly. Now promise you won't do it again, or else I'm really not going to talk to you. So Percy and Van promised, and pretty soon the wide hall resounded with merry peals of laughter. Oh, dear me, exclaimed Polly, jumping to her feet in dismay. What's the matter? Cried both boys, tumbling back in astonishment. Just look what I've done. Polly was wringing her hands now and presented a picture of distress. What, Polly? They crowded up to her again. Why, I've forgotten I was to go at once to Mrs. Sterling's, and she's been waiting. If Joel comes, send him over. The last words came back in a little shout, for Polly was off. Oh, dear me, exclaimed Percy discontentedly, losing all thought of the attractions in Ben's room. Now Polly will be gone all the whole afternoon, I most know. Let's tag her, proposed Van cheerfully, not caring to get upstairs first, since Percy wasn't going to race with him. I will, come on. No, said Percy in alarm. She won't like that. Think of something else. I've thought of one thing, and you won't do it, said Van composedly, sitting down on the very chair Polly had left. Now it's your turn. But it was no good, that old thing you thought of, retorted Percy in disdain. No one could do it. I thought it out anyway, repeated Van obstinately. And you wouldn't do it, so I'm not going to think up anything else till you have thought something, Percy Whitney. Well, you needn't be so cross, said Percy sourly, and squaring up to his chair. I'm not cross, contradicted Van, looking up at him with a very red face. Yes, you are, just as cross as a snapping turtle, said Percy, trying to think of the worst thing he had encountered, and quite pleased as he saw its effect on Van. You shall just take that back, Percy Whitney, declared Van, hopping out of his chair and doubling up his small fists. I'm not a snapping turtle. Percy edged off with a sharp lookout for the fists. I didn't say so. Yes, you did, said Van crossly. You said just that very thing, Percy Whitney, and I'm not a snapping turtle. I said you were as cross as one, said Percy, wishing he hadn't been quite as free with his comparisons, and moving off to a convenient corner. Well, that's just the same, said Van, advancing, and Polly... At the mention of Polly, Percy stopped suddenly, drew a long breath, and never thought of the corner again. Why, we promised her, he gasped. I forgot all about it. Down went Van's little fist. So we did, he said gloomily, and both boys crept off together to the same corner Percy had selected for himself. Whatever shall we do now? Breathed Percy, quite lost in his dismal reflections. We stopped, said Van, as something to be offered with a grain of hope. But we did a lot before we stopped, said Percy. A deep gloom settled over his countenance, and he wouldn't look at Van. Oh, dear me. Van fidgeted about for a minute. Well, I don't know, he said, twisting his hands. Oh, dear me. Why, you might say I'm not a snapping turtle, he cried cheerfully at last, and fairly hugging Percy in his delight. So I might, said Percy, well pleased, but I didn't say you were a snapping turtle. I said you were as cross as a snapping turtle. Well, you might say I'm not as cross as a snapping turtle then, said Van, determined to fix it in some way. So Percy said it, and then the two brothers plunged out of doors without a thought of the formalities of any plan. But it was Van who furnished it after all. "Let's go down and see Candace," he said. "Oh, yes, let's," cried Percy, and then he stopped short and began to laugh. "What's the matter?" Van twitched his sleeve. "Nothing," said Percy, so relieved he hadn't said what was on the tip of his tongue. "You've done it after all, and told something for us to do." "Well, then, come on," cried Van, with a harder twitch. So they set off at a lively pace for the delights of Candace's little shop. Meanwhile, Polly was sorrowfully confessing to Mrs. Sterling why she was late and explaining all the reason that Joel couldn't accompany her. And the whole story of the morning affair on the pond, as gathered from Jack, for Joel hadn't told a word of the encounter with the crowd of rough boys, had to be gone over with before Mrs. Sterling could open her budget of news and her wonderful plan for the Comfort Committee. She was just beginning on it. "I do like that name so very much," sighed Polly. She was on a little cricket by the side of the lounge, her hands resting on the gay sofa blanket. "Don't you?" cried Mrs. Sterling in great satisfaction. "It expresses so much, Polly. I am so very glad that you like it." "Master Joel Pepper's coming down the street," said Gibson, guilty of interrupting, for she knew how anxious her mistress was to see Joel. "Shall I call him in?" "Do, by all means," said Mrs. Sterling, while Polly cried, "Oh, I'm so glad!" So Gibson knocked on the window and beckoned to Joel that he was wanted. Then she hurried down to the big front door to let him in. There was a funny little noise over the stairs, as if there were more than a pair of feet, which was soon explained by Joel's bursting in, dragging another boy after him, who had his arm done up in a sling. "It's Jack," he said, by way of introduction. "Oh, Joel," cried Polly, springing to her feet in consternation. "Yes, and now what is it?" Joel advanced to the invalid's couch ready for business. "I'm very glad to see Jack," said Mrs. Sterling with a smile, putting out her soft white hand to the boy, who was gazing at the doorway through which he had come, as if nothing would please him so much as to go through it again, this time on the way back. "You might get a chair, Joel, for your friend, and another for yourself," suggested Mrs. Sterling. I will," cried Joel, well pleased to have something to do, and dragging up the first one he could find. "I'm going to sit on the carpet," suiting the action to the words. "Well, you see," Mrs. Sterling, without more ado, began at once on her plan. Polly was by this time back on her cricket, very much relieved to find that it wasn't so very dreadful after all to have Jack there, since Mrs. Sterling seemed to like it. There's nothing helps a boy who is to be shut up in the house for a long time quite so much as to have the other boys who can go out and play think of him and plan for his comfort. Isn't that so? Mrs. Sterling looked at her little audience keenly. "Yes," said two of them. Jack was so scared at finding himself where he had never supposed he could be, in the stately brownstone mansion, that he fixed his eyes on the carpet, not daring to move, as for speech it was quite beyond him. "Well, now that Lawrence Keep has gotten hurt, I think it will be a very good plan to have a comfort committee to look out for him." "What can we do for him?" cried Joel, very much excited and jumping up from the carpet. "Joel, do sit down," said Polly, quite ashamed, and pulling him by the jacket. Joel very unwillingly slid back to his place on the carpet and fastened his black eyes on Mrs. Sterling's face. "Well, there are so many things to do for a boy who won't be very sick but must be shut up in the house," said Mrs. Sterling, "that really it takes time even to think of them all." "What are some of them?" burst out Joel, pulling the sofa blanket in his eagerness. Joel, said Polly. "Here are some of them," said Mrs. Sterling. "That I told the boys this morning when they were in here. You might cut out the funny things in the magazines and newspapers, the pictures and the stories, and send him. It's so nice to have little reminders to pass away the time." "What else?" "Well, I didn't tell them that, but there are letters you might write him." "Ugh!" Joel made a wry face. "I don't like to write letters," he said bluntly. "Joel," said Polly again. "Perhaps that is the very reason it would be well for you to do it," said Mrs. Sterling, with a smile. "At any rate, it would please Lawrence, I think." "Well, then there are conundrums. You can surely think up something of that sort that will amuse him, and puzzles." Now, strange to say, Jack had a good head for these things, and without thinking where he was, he blurted out, "I know a lot of 'em." Joel whirled around on the carpet and stared at him, as did Polly from her cricket. But Mrs. Sterling only smiled. "That's good," she said in approval. "Now you can see you can help us out a good deal," nodding at him. But Jack, with a wild glance at the door, as he came to himself, was beyond conundrums as he thought of what he had done. "Tell some of 'em, Jack," cried Joel eagerly, emerging from his surprise. "What are they, Jack? Tell some." "Not now," said Mrs. Sterling, interposing. "Jack is going to write them out, and they will be sent in as his contribution to Lawrence." Sent in to Larry Keep's big house, almost as grand as the one Jack sat in now, by him, a little sixpenny grocer's son, doing business over at the South End. He couldn't believe his ears, and to assist them he lifted his eyes and stared at the person making the announcement. Evidently she meant it, and the more he gazed at her face, the better he liked it. But he didn't dare to stare long, so he concluded to transfer his attention from it to the carpet. "We are getting on so well," said Mrs. Sterling, and her tone was very cheery, "that I am really quite hopeful that Lawrence may be amused by all that we are to do for him. And now, before we go any further in our plan, suppose we take a little comfort ourselves." And she laughed a gay little laugh that wouldn't have sounded badly as Polly's own. "Gibson," she called. Out came Gibson from the little room next. "Will you bring us a tray of some of the nice things you always can get up, Gibson?" said her mistress. "I am really hungry, and I know these young people must be. They run about so." "I am," declared Joel, in great satisfaction at hearing the tray mentioned, and bobbing his black hair. "Awfully hungry." "Oh, Joel," said Polly. "If you knew, Polly," said Mrs. Sterling with a laugh, "what a pleasure it is to me to hear a hungry boy say so up here, you would be very glad to let him. You can't think," looking around on the three, "what good you are doing me. Really, your work as a comfort committee has begun already." End of chapter 21. Chapter number 22 of Five Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by A.C. Benson. Five Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. Rachel's visit to Miss Parrott. Rachel ran blindly up the garret stairs of the parsonage and threw herself down on the top, her blue checked apron over her head. "Oh, I can't, she screamed. "Rachel," the minister's wife called gently after her. But Rachel stormed on. "Oh, I can't, dear me, I can't." So Mrs. Henderson mounted the stairs and sat down on the top one and took Rachel's hands, nervously beating together. "My child, you must listen to me." It was said very quietly, but Rachel knew by this time what the parsonage people meant when they said a thing, so she answered meekly in a muffled voice because of the apron over her head. "Yes'm." "Take down your apron," said Mrs. Henderson. Down fell the apron, disclosing a face of so much distress that for a moment the heart of the parson's wife failed her, but it must be done. "My child," she began very gently, "it is best that you should go to see Miss Parrott. She will be a good friend to you." "I don't want no friends," said Rachel doggedly, in her distress relapsing into her old tenement house disregard of the rules of speech. "No more'n I've got her." "Ah, child, that is not a wise way to talk," said Mrs. Henderson, shaking her head. "One cannot have too many friends." "She'd be too many," said Rachel. "That old woman that came the other day in the carriage all full of bones." "You must not talk so, dear. She is a very fine woman. Now, Rachel, she has asked to have you spend the day there, and we have promised that you shall go." There was an awful pause. A big blue bottle over in the corner under the rafters was making a final decision to explore the filmy lace web beneath the window where a fat old spider had been patiently waiting for him, and he gave his last buzz of freedom before he hopped in. This was all the sound that broke the silence. Rachel held her breath and fixed her black eyes at a point straight ahead, positively sure if she withdrew her gaze she would burst out crying. "So you will be ready to go at 10 o'clock, Rachel, for Miss Parrott will send for you then," Mrs. Henderson was saying, and in a minute more the parson's wife was going down the garret stairs, Rachel, with a heart full of woe, slowly following, leaving the big garret to the fat old spider, who was busily weaving her silken threads in glee over her prisoner. And Rachel's woeful face was more than matched by the countenances of the two boys of the parson's family, who were not at all pleased that the companion sent to them by Mrs. Fisher, and who had turned out surprisingly just to their liking, should be suddenly torn away from them even for a single day. And they followed disapprovingly around, hanging upon all the preparations for the momentous visit, with a very bad influence upon Rachel's endeavor to control herself, seeing which their mothers sent them off on an errand to Grandma Bascom. So, when the ancient carriage, with its well-seasoned coachman who rejoiced in the name of Simmons, made its appearance, there was no one to see Rachel off, save the patron's wife, the minister himself being away on a call to a sick parishioner. Rachel went steadily down the walk between the box borders, feeling her heart sink at each step. Mrs. Henderson, well in advance, was down at the roadside to help her in with a last bit of good advice. "Good morning, Simmons," said the parson's wife pleasantly. "Good morning, madam." Simmons touched his hat and spoke with the air of state, for he kept his English ways. Secretly, the parson's wife was always quite impressed by them, and she looked at Rachel for some sign to that effect. But the child was scowling and biting her thin lips, and she suffered Mrs. Henderson to assist her into the wide old vehicle without any further change of expression. When once in, she gazed around, then leaned forward on the slippery old green leather seat. "Can't Pelatiah come?" she gasped. "There's lots of room." "No," said Mrs. Henderson. "Now be a good girl," all her fears returning as she saw Rachel's face. Simmons starting up the horses, that, although an old pair, yet liked to set off with a flourish, the movement bounced Rachel violently against the back of her seat and knocked her bonnet over her face. This gave her something to think of, and changed her terror into a deep displeasure. When the drive was ended, therefore, and the brougham, after its progress through an avenue of fine old trees, was brought to a standstill before the ancestral mansion where Miss Parrott's father and grandfather had lived before her, the visitor was in no condition to enjoy the pleasures thrust upon her. Miss Parrott, in the stiff black silk gown that she had worn the day when she called at the parsonage, met her on the big stone steps. She put out a hand in a long black lace mitt. "I'm very glad to see you, child," she said, in old-time hospitality. But no hospitality, old-time or any other, had a pleasant effect on Rachel. She gave a glance up and around the big, gloomy gray stone house with a wild thought of rushing down the avenue and home to the parsonage. "It is a pleasant place, isn't it?" observed Miss Parrott, with complacent memory of always living in the grandest homestead for several counties. "No, ma'am," said Rachel promptly. Miss Parrott started and gave a little gasp. Then, reflecting it was not in accordance with fine manners to notice any such slip on the part of guests, she led the way into the mansion. Simmons, much shocked, actually forgot himself so far as to scratch his head, as he drove off to the stables, and he didn't get over it all day. "Perhaps you would like a little refreshment," suggested Miss Parrott, when, the child's bonnet off, she was seated on the edge of a stiff, high-backed chair. She couldn't think of anything else to say, and as she usually offered it to her friends at the end of their long drives when they called upon her, it seemed a happy thing to do now, especially as Rachel's black eyes were fastened upon her in a manner extremely uncomfortable for the person gazed at. As Rachel didn't know in the least what refreshment meant, she stared on without a word, and Miss Parrott, pulling with more vigor than was her wont a long red worsted cord that hung down by the piano, a stately butler made his appearance quicker than usual, took his directions from his mistress, and after regarding the small figure perched on one of the ancestral Parrott chairs with extreme disfavor, he silently withdrew. Presently, in he came, his head well thrown back and bearing a huge silver tray. On it were a decanter, 2 little queer-shaped glasses, and a plate of very thin seed cakes. He deposited this on a spindle-legged table, which he drew up in front of his mistress, and, without another glance, which he intended to be very withering, cast upon Rachel, but which she didn't see at all, he departed. "Now, my dear," said Miss Parrott in a lighter tone, feeling quite in her element while serving refreshments in such an elegant way, "you must be very hungry." She poured out a glassful from the decanter, and getting out of her chair, she took up the plate of seed cakes and advanced to the small figure. Here, child." Rachel took the little queer-shaped glass, but had no sooner felt it within her hand than she gave a loud scream. "Take it away, it smells just like Gran," pushing it from her. It knocked against the plate of seed cakes Miss Parrott was proffering, and together they fell to the floor with a crash. In hurried the butler. "I don't know what can be the matter," Miss Parrott was gasping, her hand on her heart as she leaned against one of the ancient cabinets of which the apartment seemed to be full. "It smells just like Gran," Rachel was repeating, with flashing eyes. "Oh, how dare you give it to me!" She was standing over the wreck of the priceless china and glass, which, as no such accidents had been recorded in the family, Miss Parrott had continued to use in the entertainment of her guests. "You bad child, you!" exclaimed the butler, seizing her arm and gone almost out of his senses at the sight of the ruin of such ancient treasures. "I'm not bad," cried Rachel, turning on him and stamping her foot. "She's bad, that woman there, for giving me what smells just like Gran." "I can't make her out," declared the butler, eyeing her as he released her arm and stepped back towards his mistress. "And that's what makes people drunk," went on Rachel, pointing an angry finger at the wet spot where the liquid from the decanter was slowly oozing into the velvet carpet. The butler turned an outraged countenance, on which a dull red was spreading, over to his mistress. "You would better go out, Hooper," said Miss Parrott faintly, and holding fast to the cabinet. "I'm afraid to leave you, madam," said Hooper. "She ain't fit, that creature," pointing to Rachel, "to be here. She may fly at you. I'll put her out at once." "You may leave the apartment, Hooper," said Miss Parrott, regaining some of her dignity by a mighty effort. "I'm not in the least afraid." But her looks belied her words, or at any rate the old serving-man thought so, and he made bold to remonstrate again. "Let me put her out, madam," he begged. "I'll call the gardeners." "Oh, no, no," protested Miss Parrott, coming rapidly for her self-composure. "That would never do in all the world. Leave the room, Hooper." This last was said so exactly like his mistress at her best that the butler obeyed it, making a wide circuit as he passed Rachel, who still stood, the picture of wrath, over the broken china and glass. Not a word was said for some minutes. Outside, Polly, the old parrot, was scolding vociferously, and the tall clock was ticking away for clear life. Hooper, his ear first and then his eye glued to the keyhole, was vainly endeavoring to find out what was passing in the sitting-room. At last Rachel drew a long breath. "I'm sorry I broke your things," and she awkwardly pushed the bits with her shoe. "Oh, that's no matter," said Miss Parrott, feeling astonished at herself for the words. "But you said such dreadful things. I can never forget that." She drew a long breath. No matter that she broke those beautiful things. The whole truth flashed upon Rachel, and although the smell of the hated stuff was even yet dragging back to her all the memory of her low condition of life through such childhood as she had known, over and above all, it was quickly rising the conviction that for this unpardonable misdemeanor she would be sent back to the city and, awful thought, perhaps to Gran. She set her teeth together hard and clenched her thin hands as they hung by her side. "Yes, I say it is no matter," repeated Miss Parrott, not suffering herself to glance at the wreck of her ancestral treasures. "But, oh, child, why did you say such dreadful things?" She still clung to the cabinet, shocked out of one tradition of her family, as if she must still hold to its time-worn and honored furnishings. Rachel gave her a swift, bird-like glance. "You do care. You're crying," she exclaimed, aghast at the tears running over the wrinkled face. "Not about that, but the things you said. I didn't mean to do you harm." Miss Parrott did not attempt to deny the tears and brushed them off with a trembling hand. "You ain't hurt me," cried Rachel, stumbling across the floor with an awful feeling at her heart to see this stiff old woman cry. "Oh, whatever your name is, don't. I'll go home, and the minister may send me back to Gran, and she may beat me. Don't cry." She seized the heavy black silk in its front breadth and held on tightly. The butler, having at this minute his eye at the keyhole, now rushed in, unable to bear the sight, to be met by Miss Parrott, her withered face flaming behind her tears. Do you go directly out, Hooper, and remain away until you are called." He never knew how he got out, and this time the keyhole was unobstructed. "Were you beaten, you poor little thing?" Was this Miss Parrott bending over Rachel's shaking shoulders, and hands clutching the silk gown? "Oh, dear, dear!" "'Tain't no matter," mumbled Rachel. "I don't care, only don't let me go back." She shook in terror and crouched down to the floor. "Never!" said Miss Parrott firmly. All the blood in her body seemed to be in her wrinkled face, and her eyes shone, as had those of her father, the old judge, when befriending some poor unfortunate. "You shall never go back, child. Don't be afraid." But Rachel still shivered. There were the broken bits of china and glass on the floor back of her, and the minister and his wife must be told of the awful accident, and what they would do with her, why, of course, no one could tell. The thin, wrinkled fingers on which blazed many rings, that had been her mother's before her, were tremblingly smoothing Rachel's neatly braided hair. And as if she thought what was passing beneath them, Miss Parrott broke out quickly. "I shall never speak of it, of the breaking of those articles, child, so no one will know it but ourselves." "Never tell?" gasped Rachel, lifting her head in astonishment and scarcely believing her ears. "Of course not," declared Miss Parrott in scorn. "So do not be afraid any longer, but get up and dry your eyes." For at this announcement Rachel's tears had gushed out, and she sobbed as if her heart would break. For answer, Rachel flew to her feet, and without any warning, and astonishing herself equally with the recipient, she threw her arms around Miss Parrott's thin neck, and among all the ancient laces with which she delighted to adorn it, and hugged it convulsively. Taken unawares, Miss Parrott could utter no word, and Rachel clung to her and sobbed. But the old ears had heard what hadn't been sounded in them for many a long day, and forgotten were wasted heirlooms and broken treasures. "I love you," Rachel had said, hugging her tumultuously. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of 5 Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by A.C. Benson. 5 Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. The Old Parrott Homestead. "Come, child." Miss Parrott drew herself out of Rachel's clinging arms. What should she do now to divert this little girl from her terror and distress? She was sorely put to it for the answer. She gathered up the nervous hands in one of her own, and led the way out into the wide hall hung with ancestral portraits. "I'm going to take you to my own room," she said suddenly. Rachel didn't know the wonderful condescension of this plan for her amusement, but she clung to the long, thin fingers, and presently she was seated on a cricket covered with tambour work, and watching Miss Parrott's movements about the spacious apartment. "Move your cricket over here, child." Miss Parrott was unlocking what looked to Rachel's eyes like a big cupboard that stood out from the wall. It had little panes of glass all crisscrossed with strips of white wood across its face, and a set of drawers beneath. And as Rachel obediently carried the cricket over and set it down where Miss Parrott indicated, her chief attention was still upon this curious cupboard, and what Miss Parrott was doing in it, for the door now stood open. Rachel leaned forward on her cricket and rested her hands on her knees. On the shelves was such an array of articles that to the child's gaze nothing stood out distinctly as an object to lavish one's sole attention upon. But Miss Parrott made early choice, and lifting out a big doll from one of the lower shelves, she laid it in Rachel's lap. "I used to play with it," she said softly. Rachel looked down upon the doll in her lap. It was long and hard and angular as to body, and its face was a dull white, except some patches of pink on the outer edge of the cheeks, showing the rest of the coloring to have been worn away. Its eyes were staring up into Rachel's in such an expressionless, unpleasant manner that she involuntarily turned away her own. "Her name is Priscilla," said Miss Parrot, looking down at Rachel, which called her to herself and the necessity of attention to these efforts to amuse her. "Yes'm," said Rachel. "Now, I don't suppose you know how much I loved this doll," said Miss Parrot, turning her back on the cupboard to draw up a chair opposite Rachel and seat herself upon it. "But I used to take her to bed with me nights." "Did you?" said Rachel, beginning to finger the doll with sudden interest. "Yes, and I made her clothes and talked to her, and sometimes I called her sister," said Miss Parrot, quite gone in remembrance. "Oh," said Rachel. "You see, she was all I had. I was the youngest, and my real sister was married and away, and my brothers were men when I was a little girl." "Oh," said Rachel again. "And so I had to make believe that Priscilla was alive," said Miss Parrot, her eyes glowing with remembrance of her childhood, brought so singularly near on this morning. "I really had to, Rachel." "I've got a child," said Rachel, growing suddenly communicative and looking up from the old doll to watch the effect of her announcement. "Have you, dear?" responded Miss Parrot, quite pleased at the bright face from which the last tear had been wiped away. "Yes, my Phronsie gave her to me, and she sleeps with me," said Rachel in great satisfaction. "I suppose she is very much like Priscilla," observed Miss Parrot. "Oh, no, she isn't," declared Rachel promptly, turning her mind again to the ancient doll. "My child is pretty, and she shuts her eyes. She isn't a bit like yours." "Well, Priscilla was always pretty to me," said Miss Parrot, astonished that she felt so little the slight to her child. "Well, now, Rachel, we will put the doll aside. You may lay it on the bed and then come back here." Rachel got off from her cricket and went over to the other side of the apartment. "My, what a funny bed!" she exclaimed, using her eyes to their utmost to see as much of the canopy, with its tester of blue and white chintz, the 4 posts beneath, and the counterpane executed in honeycomb pattern. Miss Parrot, exploring her cupboard to get out something else with which to entertain Rachel, did not hear her, so she slowly returned, walking backward to observe as much of this queer article of furniture as the time allowed. In this way she fell over the cricket. "Dear me!" exclaimed Miss Parrot, pulling her head out of the cupboard. "Did you hurt yourself, child?" "No'm," said Rachel, getting up with a very red face and exceedingly ashamed. "I don't believe I broke it." She set the cricket up in its proper position and anxiously examined it all over. "Oh, no," said Miss Parrot reassuringly. "The cricket is not harmed. See here, Rachel." She held in her hand a long string of little irregular things that dangled as she turned toward her. "I am going to put these on your neck. Now stand still, child." And suiting the action to the words, something snapped with a little click under Rachel's chin. Rachel looked down quickly at the queer little odd-shaped red things hanging over her breast. "I used to wear them when I was a little girl, very much smaller than you," said Miss Parrot, her head on one side and falling back to see the effect. "What are they?" asked Rachel, not daring to lay a finger on them, and holding her breath at the idea of being within the magnificent circle of Miss Parrot's early adornments. "Red coral beads," said Miss Parrot, smiling at the nice contrast between the necklace and the dark little face above. "Now, child, you are going to wear them whenever you come to visit me, and as long as you stay, and that means they will not come off till tomorrow, for you are to sleep here tonight." "I haven't any nightgown," said Rachel, who by this time liked to stay well enough, but seeing here an insuperable objection. "That's easily managed," said Miss Parrot quickly. "I shall send a note to the parsonage saying you will stay, and—" At the mention of note, Rachel suddenly collapsed, and a look of terror spread over her face. "Oh, I forgot!" she cried. "Why, what is the matter, child?" demanded Miss Parrot in great concern. "I must go and get it," said Rachel wildly, and dashing blindly off, she left Miss Parrot standing in front of her ancestral cupboard holding her childish treasures to rush over the long and winding back stairs. At their end she found herself hopelessly entangled in an array of back passages and little old-fashioned apartments, from which, run as she would, she could never seem to find the right exit. Her progress was noted with indignation and contempt by as many of the old retainers in the Parrot service as could be gathered at short notice, and their calls to her to leave the premises, accompanied by sundry shakings of a long crash towel in the hands of the cook, only impeded Rachel's hope of success. I don't know the way out, she cried at last, finding herself in a big closet whose door, being open, she fondly trusted would allow her passage out into the free air. Well, 'tisn't here, said an angry voice, and the brandishing of a big iron spoon made Rachel beat a hasty retreat, this time into the back hall. Miss Parrott was just descending the stairs, her stiff black silk skirt held high, before she set foot in the servants' quarters. Child, she said in reproach, what is the matter? Oh, I've lost the note. I forgot it. Rachel flew to her and wailed it all out. She's crying, that bad girl is, all over mistress's front breadth, announced Joanna, the parlor maid, through the little window of the butler's pantry. La me, ejaculated the cook, raising her hands in the crush towel. To think of our mistress so demeaning herself. What note? Cried Miss Parrott in great bewilderment. Rachel, stop crying at once and speak plainly. What note do you mean? The one Mrs. Henderson gave me, cried Rachel. I must go and get it, but I don't know the way out. To give to me? Did Mrs. Henderson tell you to give it to me? Asked Miss Parrott, beginning to see light. Yes'm. Oh, please let me out, begged Rachel. I left it in the carriage. Ah, well then, we'll go out this way. And there, turning to the left, was the passage down which Rachel had plunged twice before, and at its end a small green door that, when opened, led out through an arbor overrun with creepers to a short cut to the stables. Now then, Miss Parrott gathered up the train of her black silk gown and put it over her arm, then in full view of the latticed window of the kitchen and scullery department, she sallied forth across the greensward to the stables beyond, Rachel's brown hand tucked in her own. Laws on me, it was a scullery maid who screamed this out. She's got on Miss Parrott's coral beads. You're a ninny, cried the cook, turning on her in disdain. Go back to your pots and kettles, Anne. Whatever would she have to do with the mistress's beads? It's some old string you see around her neck. I tell you it's Miss Parrott's red beads, declared Anne stoutly. She might be sent back to her work among the pots and kettles, but she would stick fast to her tail. I seen 'em when I went up to Miss Parrott's room with the bellows I'd cleaned this very morning, through the little winders to her cupboard, and I'd know 'em anywhere. The cook stamped her foot, shaking the crash towel which she still retained, and Anne withdrew to those inner precincts that were considered her department. Meanwhile, Miss Parrott was talking to Simmons, who, touching his hat respectfully when he saw her approach, now came up to await her commands. Have the goodness to open the brougham door, Simmons, said Miss Parrott, going through the carriage house to the corner where that ancient vehicle was stored. Simmons obeyed wonderingly, with an eye askance at Rachel by the other side of Miss Parrott, eagerly pressing forward. Now jump in, said Miss Parrott. But this command was not needed, for Rachel was already within the family coach and prowling around on the old green leather cushion and over the floor with both nervous hands. It isn't. Oh, yes, it is. And up she came, red and shining, to hold out a small white envelope. Miss Parrott leaned against the broom and broke the seal. Rachel, her whole heart in one glad thrill of joy, made little sign except to heave a deep sigh of relief that the note had been found. Simmons, seeing no excuse for lingering further, went back to one of the carriages to go through the form of inspecting its exterior, while he still kept an eye employed in the direction of his mistress. Dear Miss Parrott, so the note ran, I really do not think it is wise to ask Rachel to remain overnight. I will explain later. Another time, perhaps she may do so. Yours respectfully, Elmira Henderson. Dear me, exclaimed Miss Parrott to herself, and folding up the little note into many creases, she stood lost in thought. Well, I suppose I must yield to the parson's wife, for she has some good reason, but the child shall stay next time. Rachel, whose spirits had risen, since it was quite positive that the note was not lost, now seized Miss Parrott's hand and hopped and skipped by her side across the green grass on their return to the mansion. Simmons came out of his retirement, his chamois skin with which he had been ostensibly polishing up a carriage, still in his hand, to stand in the doorway to watch them. Well, I am surprised, he declared, quite slowly and impressively, as befitted a serving man to an old genteel family. "Oh, let's go in there," cried Rachel, catching sight of the tall hollyhocks behind a wicket gate and pulling at the long, slender fingers. Miss Parrot hesitated. "Well, just one peep," she said, "for it is near to luncheon time," and she pulled out the watch from her belt. But to Rachel a peep meant all the world, so she dropped the fingers and raced through the gateway to get there first and thus make it last as long as possible. "Oh, oh!" she cried, her little dark face aflame with delight. "It's the most beautiful place." Then she began to run up and down all the narrow paths, marking the circles and hearts and diamonds in which the old-fashioned garden was laid out, and sniffing the fragrance as she ran. Miss Parrot seated herself on a stone seat by the fountain in the center. Her delight was quite equal to Rachel's, and the thin, wrinkled face assumed a more peaceful expression than it had carried for many a day, so that when Hooper came to summon her to luncheon, he was fairly taken aback at its unwonted cheer. "Rachel!" Miss Parrot's voice had a pleasant ring to it. Rachel came dancing along a little curving path, the red coral beads flying up and down on her breast, her cheeks nearly as red. "Oh, it's perfectly beautiful here!" she cried. "Do you like it?" Miss Parrot's thin cheek glowed too. It carried her back to the day when she as a child had been skipping in that old garden, and her heart gave a throb at the thought that there were perhaps in store for her many delights yet through Rachel's enjoyment of the old-fashioned flowers and shrubs. "But come, child," she brought herself up suddenly to say, with a little laugh, "Hooper has summoned us to luncheon, and we must obey." "Do you have to obey a servant?" asked Rachel, coming out of her dance to fall into step by her side and looking up with wide-open eyes. "Always," said Miss Parrot most positively, "else they won't obey me if I don't. It's system that makes everything comfortable, Rachel." As Rachel knew nothing whatever about system, she followed silently, her small head full of the beautiful garden in which she had been rioting, and which, oh joy, Miss Parrot promised she should visit again when the luncheon was over. And seated at the polished mahogany table, she was so lost in thought that Miss Parrot, in state at the other end, was obliged to speak to her twice before she looked up. "Finish your soup, child," said Miss Parrot. Rachel hadn't even begun it, and she now seized the first thing upon which her hand rested, a heavy silver fork. Hooper, back of his mistress's chair, darted forward to put the right implement before her. But Rachel gave him a withering glance that stopped him halfway. "You don't need to come, I've got it." And she held up her spoon triumphantly, and ever after, all through the meal, she seemed to view his necessary advances as so many affronts intended to show up her lack of manners, and she exercised all her wits to keep him at bay, so that the old butler was glad when the meal was over. But long before that time arrived, Rachel had leaned back in her tall carved chair, letting her knife and fork rest on her plate while she feasted her eyes over the table, what it held, and then around the whole apartment. "There's some of the same flowers like the ones in the garden," she said, bringing her gaze back to point to the old-fashioned silver vase and its nodding clusters in the center of the table. "What are they?" "Those are larkspur," said Miss Parrot, craning her neck to see around the high silver service from which she poured her tea. "And what's the other, this side?" Rachel bobbed over on her chair till Hooper involuntarily closed his eyes, expecting she would go entirely off from her chair, and he didn't want to see it. It would be so disgraceful at a parrot table. "That?" Miss Parrot, too, leaned over on her chair. "Oh, why, that's a ragged robin, Rachel." "Ragged Robin," repeated Rachel, hopping off from her chair. "Oh, I want to see it," and she ran around the table end and leaned over to get a better view. "'Tisn't a bit ragged," she cried, very much disappointed. "And besides, he isn't there." "Oh, Rachel!" exclaimed Miss Parrot in dismay. "You must not do so. We never leave our chairs when we are at the dining table." Rachel, thus admonished, scuttled back to her seat, while Hooper groaned and pretended not to see anything. But she kept her black eyes fastened on the ragged robins. "There isn't any bird there," she said. "What, child?" "You said there was a robin in those flowers," said Rachel again, using her little brown fingers to designate the vase and its contents. "And that he was ragged. and there isn't any." "Oh, dear me," exclaimed Miss Parrot. Then she laughed. "The flowers are called ragged robins, Rachel," she said. "Oh," said Rachel. Then she laughed too, a merry little peal that just bubbled over because she was happy. "Now eat your luncheon," said Miss Parrot. "Hooper, you may give her some more milk." "I don't want any more milk," said Rachel, waving him off with quite an air. "I've got lots and lots," peering into her cup. She took up her knife and fork again, but looking over them found so many things to call for more attention than they seemed to be worthy of, that she soon laid them down again upon her plate. "Where did you used to sit when you was a little girl?" she asked suddenly, when she had been reflecting a bit. I sat at the side of the table," said Miss Parrot, starting as she was thus hastily summoned down into her past. "Then can't I sit there now?" cried Rachel, flying out of her chair again. "Say, can't I? Do let me." She ran clear around the table and hung over Miss Parrot's chair. Hooper groaned again and looked steadfastly out the opposite window. "My child," exclaimed Miss Parrot. Her tone was very grave, but she put her long arm around Rachel and drew her closely to her. "Remember what I said. You must not leave your chair during a meal." "I forgot." Rachel flew back again, not waiting for her request to be granted, and sat down meekly in her place. "And you must eat something," continued Miss Parrot, glancing at the little girl's plate, and with dreadful qualms at her old heart for having been severe. "If you don't, Rachel, Mrs. Henderson won't let you come here again." The solemn butler folded and unfolded his hands, while his face expressed the belief that such a calamity could possibly be borne. "And if you didn't come, Rachel," Miss Parrot took up her cup of tea and set it down again untouched, "I should feel very sorry, I should indeed," she added, with a little catch in her throat. "So should I," said Rachel abruptly. Then she picked up her knife and fork and began to eat as fast as she could. "Oh, my dear," cried Miss Parrot, quite horrified. "Not so fast. Pray don't, Rachel," looking down at the table length in distress. Rachel by this time was alive to the disgrace she was undergoing, and she turned quite pale, and deserting her food altogether, sat stiff and straight on her chair, too miserable to care for anything. Miss Parrot bore this for a breathing space, and then without a warning she slipped off from her chair and went quickly down to the end of the table. "I'm not blaming you, you poor little thing," she declared, bending over the dark hair. "Don't think so, Rachel." Rachel turned with a swift movement and hid her face in the laces falling from Miss Parrot's breast. "I want to go home to Mrs. Henderson's," she sobbed. "We don't care for any more luncheon, Hooper," said Miss Parrot hoarsely, taking Rachel's hand. "We will go into the other room," and she led her off sobbing. When Rachel reached Hooper, however, standing petrified with surprise, she looked up at him defiantly and brushed the tears from her cheek, and after they had passed out, Hooper still stood in a daze. At last he came out of it, and, ejaculating, "Well, I never did," he began to clear the table. Once outside, Miss Parrot turned suddenly. "We'll go back to the garden," she said. This pleased Rachel very much, and she forgot her distress and mortification, and actually smiled up into the old face. "Your hand's shaking," she announced, turning her gaze to the long, slender fingers covering her own little brown palm. "Is it?" said Miss Parrot absently. "Yes, it shakes dreadfully," said Rachel with a critical air. "Look," pointing down at it. "Oh, that is nothing," began Miss Parrot, then she stopped suddenly and put both hands on the thin little shoulders. "Oh, child," she said brokenly, "I did so hope you'd like me, for I've nothing in this world to live for, Rachel, and now you want to go back to the parsonage." "Oh, I don't want to go back. I do love you," cried Rachel in great alarm, and she raised her little brown hands and actually smoothed the long, wrinkled face between them. "Don't look so. You look dreadful," she pleaded. For at the touch of those childish hands over her face, Miss Parrot broke utterly down, all her aristocratic traditions falling away in a second of time to reveal her lonely, hopeless life. And she sobbed in a way very hard for any onlooker to hear. To Rachel, powerless to stop her, it seemed the most terrible thing in all this world, and she burst out in her misery. "I'll stay here forever if you'll stop." That word forever did what nothing else could have achieved. It brought Miss Parrot to herself. Then it was Rachel who led her about the old-fashioned garden and chattered about the flowers, unmindful whether or not she was answered, until presently Miss Parrot was quite recovered and even smiling in a well-pleased way. At last she pulled out her ancient watch from her belt. "Now, Rachel," she said, "you must go back to the parsonage this afternoon, for Mrs. Henderson expects you." "I'll stay if you want me to," said Rachel, moving closer to Miss Parrot's side. "No, dear, not today, because it wouldn't be right. The parson and his wife only loaned you to me for today, but—" "What's loaned?" interrupted Rachel abruptly and wrinkling her forehead. "Why, they only let me have you just for today," said Miss Parrot. "Oh. And so you must go back, but I shall come for you again." And Miss Parrot turned a hungry glance down upon the dark little face at her side. "I'll come," said Rachel, with a sociable nod. "And Rachel," Miss Parrot drew her closer to her side, "you may keep the coral beads, dear. That shows you are really coming back to me to stay." "Forever and always?" cried Rachel, patting the necklace lovingly with one hand. "Can I keep 'em just forever? Say, can I?" "Yes, child." Miss Parrot's old face smiled in delight at the compact. "They are yours to keep all your life. And now," she added brightly, "I want you to come into the drawing-room and—" "What's drawing-room?" demanded Rachel, who felt it much better for all concerned in a conversation to understand things as they went along. "Why, that is the parlor," answered Miss Parrot. "Oh, I want to hear you sing, Rachel," cried Miss Parrot longingly. "I can't hardly wait. Come." She hurried the little child along with hasty steps, Rachel skipping by her side. "I'll sing," she said, "all you want me to. I know lots and lots of things," until the grand piano in the long, dim drawing-room, not opened for many years, was reached. Then she spun down the middle of the apartment. "I'm going to dance first," she announced, picking out the skirt of her gown on either side. "My, but ain't it dark here, though?" End of chapter 23, read by A.C. Benson.
Chapter 24 of Five Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sly Fox. Five Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. Rachel's Future. When the old brougham drew up in front of the colonial door, Miss Parrot let her hands fall away from the time-stained piano keys. "It can't surely be time for you to go, Rachel." Then she did a thing she could not remember doing in all of her life. She deliberately went on with her employment, allowing Simmons to wait on his carriage box, while she broke up the system of years that had always made her punctual to a minute. "You may sing that over again, Rachel," she said, beginning on the strains of the opera that Rachel had gathered from the barrel organ on the street corners. "Then may I dance again?" begged Rachel. "Please, just once before I go." "Yes," said Miss Parrot, sitting very straight, and giving all the graceful little quirks to the slender fingers which her music master, long since dead and buried, had taught her. "Now begin, child." So up and down, high and clear, rang Rachel's voice, with no more effort than the birds outside put forth, the sound penetrating the ancient walls and paralyzing every domestic, while it nearly made Simmons, outside, fall from his box. "She hain't touched that piano in 10 years," said the cook, in a hushed voice. "Oh, me? I'm afraid she's going to die," and she flung her apron over her head. "Die?" exclaimed Hooper, finding his voice. "She won't die with that young one here," he added, in scorn. "Now may I dance?" pleaded Rachel, plucking Miss Parrot's sleeve. "Do let me. You said I might." "Yes," said Miss Parrot, wrenching herself from the operatic strains to begin on a little old-fashioned jig. "Oh, that's so funny," giggled Rachel, hopping aimlessly in the center of the big drawing room and trying to keep time. "Do stop! You put me all out." "But that is a dancing tune," said Miss Parrot, jingling away, "and sister and I used to dance quite prettily to it, I remember." "Well, I can't," said Rachel, hopping wildly and doing her best to get into step. "Oh, dear!" she brought up suddenly, flushed and panting. "What is the matter, Rachel?" Miss Parrot let her hands rest on the yellow ivory keys and looked over her shoulder at her. "Oh, I can't dance," said Rachel. "When you play so funnily, it doesn't go like that, it goes like this." She picked up her gown again and made a sweep off in one direction and then another, her feet scarcely touching the pictured roses and lilies with which the velvet carpet was strewn, all the while singing a tune that seemed to carry her off on its own melody, and watched her. It was therefore much later than the personage people expected when the old brougham set Rachel down at their gate, and she walked into the house supported on either side by Peletiah and Ezekiel, who had been watching there a full hour for her arrival. "I like her," she said, marching up to the minister's wife. "She gave me these," putting a hand on the red coral beads on her neck, "and I'm going back to-morrow, I guess." But it wasn't to stay that Rachel went back on the morrow. It was only for a day, despite all the pleadings made by Miss Parrot, and all the desire of the parson and his wife to please their honoured parishioner, and most of all the earnest wish to consent to what would have probably been for the child's best good. They held firmly to their first statement, that nothing could be arranged till Miss Fisher and Mr. King had been consulted. "They have sent the child here to us, and here she must stay until they make some other arrangement," they said firmly, and no amount of urging could make them say anything else. So letters had to fly back and forth from the parsonage and the King estate in the big city, and Miss Parrot wrote long letters in a pinched, ladylike hand in very faint ink, crossing the paper whenever she was afraid she hadn't said enough to plead her cause successfully, which condition of mind she was in perpetually all through these writing days. These letters old Mr. King endeavoured to read at the first, but he soon threw them down impatiently. "The child shall never go to a woman who has no more sense," he loudly declared. Then Polly or Jasper would hurry in and wade through the missives, and when he saw the hungry longing of the desolate soul, and the sweet refinement of the writer came out, and the sterling honesty were revealed in the prim sentences, he relented and went tumultuously over to the other side. "Yes, yes, she shall go," he declared, pulling out his big handkerchief to blow his nose violently, to remove all suspicion that anything was the matter with his eyes. "'Twould be the best thing for her. Of course she must go." And so it was finally settled that Rachel was to live at Miss Parrott's, and be her own little girl, going down to the parsonage every day to learn her lessons, under Mr. Henderson's care, until the time when she would be ready to be sent to such a school as Miss Parrot might select should arrive. "And she must come and see me sometimes," said Phronsie, when the announcement was made in the King household. "My little girl may come, can't she, grandpa?" she begged. "Yes, yes, child," said old Mr. King warmly. "We all shall want to see Rachel now and then." The comfort committee being well established and in fine running order by this time, Mrs. Sterling gathering them around her sofa, in a spacious sitting room upstairs, Polly and Alexia saw no reason why they shouldn't begin work on the cooking club, "because," said Polly, "if we are really going to learn how to cook things, why, we ought to begin." And the mothers of the several boys and the girls who were to form taking instantly to the idea, two girls and Jasper set to work to write the notices of the first meeting. "We ought to have another boy," said Jasper, on the committee. Alexia wrinkled up her face. "Oh, don't! Boys are so tiresome," she said. "Why, I am a boy," said Jasper, bursting into laughter. "Oh, well, you are different," said Alexia. "We always expect you around." "Thank you," said Jasper, with a low bow. "I'm sure I ought to feel very much complimented, Alexia," and he laughed again. "Well, I'm sure boys are such nuisances," said Alexia, leaning her long arms on the table. "They were in the library at Mr. King's. And besides, they won't want to come to our cooking club, I verily believe. So what's the use of having them on the committee?" "Oh, yes, they will," declared Jasper, eagerly. "You don't know anything about that, if you say that. Why, Claire and Pickering, and ever so many more are just wild to be asked." "Oh, well, then if we've got to have some boy on the committee," said Alexia, accepting the situation, "let's ask Pickering Dodge." "I'd rather have Pick," said Jasper, in a tone of great satisfaction, and Polly saying the same thing. It was decided then and there. "Well, now that matter is off our hands," said Alexia. "Let's get to writing these old notices," and her hands began to bustle about among the little pile of paper and envelopes. "Hold on," said Jasper. "If Pick is to be on this committee, he must help us with these things, and he'll want to, for it'll be great fun." "Oh, bother!" exclaimed Alexia, jerking back her chair. "Now we've got to wait. You see for yourself what a nuisance it is to try to get boys like you in, Jasper." "Oh, I'll get Pick over here in a jiffy," declared Jasper, plunging out of the library. "You won't have to wait long for us, Alexia." It wasn't more than 10 minutes by the clock when in rushed two boys and swarmed around the big table. "Well, I declare!" cried Alexia, looking up admiringly from the receipt book which Mrs. Fisher had loaned them, and over which the heads of two girls were bent. "If you boys hadn't been quick, though." "Haven't we?" cried Jasper, and his eyes twinkled. "Don't tell," whispered Pickering over his shoulder. "And what are you two whispering about?" cried Alexia, deserting the cookbook. "Now tell us," she demanded, dreadfully afraid she would miss some news. "Well, you see," began Jasper. "Hush, hush," said Pickering. "Now don't pay attention to Pickering," said Alexia, turning a cold shoulder to the last mentioned individual. "Do tell us, Jasper. What is it?" "The fact is," said Jasper, laughing, "I didn't have to go for Pickering at all. That is, only to the corner. He was coming here." "And Jasper nearly knocked the breath out of me," finished Pickering. "He bolted into me so." "Well, you were on the wrong side of the pavement," retorted Jasper. "Is that all?" cried Alexia, horribly disappointed to get no news. "Oh, dear me! Well, do sit down, now you have come, and let us get to these horrible old notices." So the boys drew up their chairs, and Polly pushed the cookbook with an affectionate little pat into the centre of the table. "That's what we were going to study," she said, gleefully. "Study?" echoed Pickering, with a very long face. "I didn't come over here to study. I get enough of that at school," and he glared in a very injured way at Jasper. "Don't get upset," said Jasper, patting him on the back. "You'll like this, Pick, I tell you." "And it's a cookbook," said Polly, laughing merrily. "All right," said Pickering, immensely relieved, and reaching out his long arm, he seized it and whirled the leaves. "Lemon pie. That sounds good. How to cook cabbage. Oh, dear me. See here now." Jasper seized the book and shut it with a big bang. No one is going to look into that until we write these notices. Why haven't we got a cooking club yet?" "Give it back," roared Pickering after him, as Jasper hopped out of his chair, carrying the book. "No, sir," cried Jasper, bearing off the book out of the room. "There you'll never find that," he observed, coming back to slip into his seat with satisfaction. "Well, now," said Alexia, sweetly, "if you two boys are through scrapping, we'll begin on these notices." She picked an envelope from the pile. "Oh, dear me!" Who was the first one to ask? "I think Larry ought to have it," said Polly. "Oh, Polly Pepper!" exclaimed Alexia. "Larry can't come for ever so long, with his collarbone all smashed and his leg hurt. The very idea!" Polly gave a little shiver. "Well, you would like to be asked," she said. "And I think so, too," declared Jasper. "A chap would enjoy it twice as much to get an invitation when he was abed and couldn't come." "Well, that's nice to say," cried Alexia, bursting into a loud laugh, in which Pickering joined. "You've done it now," he said, clapping Jasper on the back. "I'm glad of it, old chap, after the way you acted about that old cookbook." "So I have," said Jasper, grimly. Then he laughed as hard as the others. "Well, you know what I mean, and we ought to give Larry the first attention." "I'm going to write the notice to him," declared Alexia, dipping her pen in the inkwell and beginning with a flourish. Then she threw it down before she had finished saying, "Polly, you ought to write the first notice," she cried. "You propose the club." "That's no matter," said Polly, "so long as we're going to have the club. Go ahead, Alexia." "No, I'm not going to," said Alexia obstinately. "No, no, I'm not going to," said Alexia obstinately, and leaning back in her chair. "You've just got to do it, Polly, so there. There'll be no peace, Polly, for any of us until you do it," said Pickering, thrusting his hands lazily into his pockets. "And I think people would better to go to work and help," said Alexia decidedly, "than to set other people against. Oh, dear me!" as she found herself hopelessly entangled. "You would do better to get yourself out of that sentence, Alexia," laughed Jasper, "before you do anything else." "Oh, I don't care," said Alexia, joining in the general laugh. "It's too mean for anything, Pickering, to say I fight, when everyone knows how I suffer just everything before I say a word." "Oh, dear me!" cried Pickering faintly. "And when you two stop sparring," said Jasper, "perhaps we can do some work." "Come now, Polly. Polly and I don't propose to do the whole." "And when you two stop sparring," said Jasper, "perhaps we can do some work. Come now, Polly and I don't propose to do the whole." Alexia, at this, scrambled up another envelope and began to write as fast as she could, and Pickering, selecting a pen and getting down to business, the room began to assume a very work-like aspect. "Now that's done," said Alexia, tossing aside the envelope. "I've addressed notice number 2. "Whose is it?" asked Pickering, glancing up from his own to the scrawling characters where the envelope lay face uppermost on the table. "Who was number 2, Alexia?" "You mustn't see," cried Alexia, twitching away. "You go on and address your own, Pickering, and let mine alone." "Well, I've seen already," said Pickering coolly. "It would be impossible not to read your writing a mile off, Alexia." "Well, that's much better than to write such mean, lazy little words that no one can make out," she retorted. "Oh, clear! We haven't a pattern of the notice made yet," said Polly, leaning back in her chair after the labour of getting the first envelope addressed, and she pushed up the little brown rings of her hair from her brow, for Polly didn't like very well to write, and it always took her some time to achieve anything in that line. "Jasper, you draw up one," she begged. "Oh, dear me!" cried Jasper, aghast. "I can't, Polly. You can do it much better." "Misery me!" exclaimed Polly. "I couldn't do it in all this world." And she looked so distressed that Jasper hastened to say, Come along then, Pig, and help me out and I'll try. But Picketing, protesting that he didn't know any more how to write such a notice than Prince lying on the rug just before the fire, Jasper in despair drew up a sheet of paper and wrote in big, staring words, with a great flourish, clear across the top of the page, "Attention." "Goodness me!" cried Pickering, his pale eyes following Jasper's pen. "It looks like a fire alarm summons, or just like Miss Salisbury when she's going to say something quite ugly and horrid," said Alexia, with a grimace. "Oh, Alexia!" said Polly. "Well, it does," said Alexia. "You know for yourself, Polly." She always stands up, quite stiff on the platform, and says, "Attention, young ladies." Oh, I quite hate the word, because we all have to look at her. "Well, it does good service then," said Jasper, coolly, "since it makes you do the very thing wanted." "And we wouldn't mind looking at her," said Alexia, running off with a reminiscence. "If she didn't make us do this every single day." "And we wouldn't mind looking at her," said Alexia, running on with her reminiscences, "if she didn't make us do every single thing she says." "That's too bad," said Jasper, with a laugh, and flourishing away on the second line of the notice. "You needn't laugh," said Alexia, grimly. "I guess you wouldn't if you had had your Miss Salisbury at your school, Jasper King." "Is she any worse than our Mr. Fraser?" said Jasper. "I wonder. I tell you what, Alexia, he keeps us boys at it, doesn't he, Pig?" "Well, I rather guess," said Picketing concisely, but his look told volumes. "Oh, you boys have an easy enough time," said Alexia with a sniff, "and you are always grumbling about how hard it is, while I don't say a word, but just bear things." "I'm so sorry for poor Miss Salisbury," observed Pickering, lazily watching Jasper's efforts. "Well, you needn't be," retorted Alexia. "She's very fond of me, Miss Salisbury is, and I don't know in the least know what she'd do if I left her school. But I never shall go away. I just dote on her." "It looks like it," said Pickering with a laugh. "Well, I do," declared Alexia. "She's my very sweetest friend, except Polly Pepper. So there. Oh dear me, I don't know what to say next," cried Jasper, holding off the notice at arm's length and scowling at it dreadfully. "You ought to see your face, Jasper," cried Alexia. "Dear me, it's positively awful." "Well, it's not half as bad as I feel," said Jasper, "with this terrible old notice weighing me down." "Attention," drawled Pickering, reading the 2 lines. "You are requested to appear." "Hold on," cried Jasper, turning over the notice. "Who told you to read it out, pray tell?" "I'm on the committee, I'd have you know," said Pickering, coolly. "Attention," drawled Pickering, reading the 2 lines. "You are requested to appear." "Hold on," cried Jasper, turning over the notice. "Who told you to read it out, pray tell?" "I'm on the committee, I'd have you know," said Pickering, coolly. "Well, we'll pitch you out," said Jasper, "neck and heels if you don't take care." "Well, but this really is an awful work." He whirled over the notice again and glared at it savagely. "Why don't we just say a cooking club is to be formed?" proposed Polly. "And oh, that would be elegant," interrupted Alexia, clapping her hands. "Oh, Polly, you write it." "Oh, I couldn't," said Polly, drawing back. "Yes, Polly, do," begged Jasper. "Oh, no, you write it," said Polly. "Well, then, you tell me what to say," said Jasper, laughing. "She did," said Alexia impatiently. "A cooking club is to be formed. Didn't you hear her?" "I have that," said Jasper, scribbling away on a fresh piece of paper. "Now what next?" "Go on, Polly," said Alexia. "Well, oh, will you please come to the first meeting?" "And see how you like it," finished Alexia. "That's just elegant. Do write it down, Jasper." "You may be sure I will," cried Jasper, vastly pleased that he was going to be helped out, and finishing up all with great energy. For what else? And he poised his pen in the air and looked at Polly. Why, isn't that enough? Said Polly, a little pucker beginning to come on her forehead. I should think so, said Pickering. It tells all the story. And they will come, you may be sure, said Jasper, holding off the notice again, this time for everybody's inspection. And that's the main thing. And now we can all begin to write them, said Alexia, in great satisfaction, seizing a pen, which she had dropped. Do put it in the middle of the table, Jasper, where we can all see. Wait till I write a good one, said Jasper, beginning on a fresh sheet of paper. I was hurrying so to get it all down, you can hardly read it. So he wrote it out on his best hand, then propped the notice against the bookmark. Now begin, he said. Let's race, cried Alexia, already scrawling the first words at a great rate. Oh dear me, we shan't do it decently then, said Polly in alarm. I mean, I shan't if we race. Nor I, either, said Jasper. Well, I'm not going to race anyway, declared Pickering, making slow, lazy strokes with his pen. It's quite bad enough when you have to write these odious things without breaking one's neck over them. Well, don't. Let's talk, said Alexia, seeing that she couldn't have any part of the conversation since all her mind had to do to get into her task. Oh dear me, I left out the dot to my I, and misery, there's a blot. It was all because I was listening to you, Pickering Dodge. Well, we'll all be as still as mice then, said Polly, so no sound was heard save the scratching of pens over the paper as the work went gaily on. Oh, isn't it too bad that we can't have any of us find that $10 bill Joel lost at the garden party? Broke out Alexia, when this sort of thing had preceded them for a time. Cried Polly, and her pen slipped, making an awful scratch, and just spoiling the best notice she had written. Jasper raised his head and cast a warning glance over the table at Alexia, but it was too late. I do believe we shall find it some time, said Polly, scraping away the ink eraser and only making things worse. Take care, Polly. The ink is too fresh, warned Jasper. Wait until it dries. Well, I've made it all up now, said Polly, leaning back in a chair and viewing her work from despair. Perhaps it can be fixed, said Alexia, overwhelmed with distress and leaning forward to see the worst. I most know it can. Let me try, Polly. No, no, Alexia, I wouldn't, said Jasper. It's quite bad enough already. Why, maybe I can do it, persisted Alexia. If I could only try. You may try, said Polly, pushing the paper towards her when she saw Alexia's face. But it's no matter anyway. I'll write another. And she had already begun it when Alexia threw down the ink eraser. It's no sort of use, she said, and I've made a shocking hole in the paper. Oh dear me. And she looked so utterly miserable that Polly's brow cleared, and she began to laugh. Dear me, she said, it isn't a bit of matter, and see, I've ever done so much already on this. I do believe we shall find that $10 note sometime. I do verily believe so, Alexia. So do I, cried Jasper heartily. Pickering said nothing. He didn't really believe the $10 bill would ever be found, having helped Jasper to ransack so many possible and impossible places. But he wasn't going to say so, and thus added to the general agreement. And I think it was awfully nice of Joel to do that dreadful work over Mr. King's old books, and earn the money, said Alexia. Polly looked up with a smile. Wasn't it? She cried radiantly. And father says Joe does the list so well, said Jasper heartily. And he sticks at it every day like a leech, and it can't. And father says Joe does the list so well, said Jasper heartily. He sticks at it every day like a leech, and they can't anything get off to play till the hour is over. Well, I don't see how he can, said Alexia, drawing a long breath. Dear me, it would just tire me to death. Why, Polly Pepper. Alexia threw down her pen and stared at her. When is the first meeting to be? Why, said Polly, writing away laboriously. Next Wednesday evening, of course. Well, we don't say, said Alexia. How in the world are they to know? The other members of the committee stopped work immediately and glanced ruefully at the little pile of notices accumulating in the middle of the table. We can never write those all over again, began Polly tragically. Pickering put out a long hand and picked out from the pile the one she had written. Pickering put out a long hand and picked out from the pile the one he had written. I shall just write. Wednesday evening, July 21st. Down in one corner, he said. Oh, goody! Exclaimed Alexia, her face brightening. I shall do mine so, pulling out her scores from the heap of notices. But we don't tell where the meeting is to be, said Jasper, after they had all fallen to work again. At this second fright, no one seemed to be able to speak. It was Alexia who first found her voice. Why not put it in the other corner? She asked. And that just balances, said Jasper, holding one of his notices up when the two additions had been made. So it really looks better than ever. But we mustn't make any blunders, observed Pickering wisely. For we haven't any extra corners to go now. Oh, we aren't going to make any, declared Alexia, and we will soon be through. Thank goodness, as the pens set up lively work once. I hope so. Polly gave a long sigh. Oh dear me, it wouldn't be one half so hard to do cooking for the cooking club as to write a single one of these. End of chapter 24. Read by Sly Fox on the 20th of June 2023.
Chapter number 25 of Five Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kat Sadler. Five Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. Jack Parrish. Grandpapa! Joel came in with a shout, rushed around the room 2 or 3 times, and finally came up to the big writing table, quite blown. Dear me! Exclaimed old Mr. King, laying down his pen. Have you really got through, Joe? Grandpapa, said Joel, his black eyes shining and bobbing over his head to get a good look into the old gentleman's face. She's asked him. She really has. Who? Asked Mr. King, very much puzzled. Mrs. Sterling, said Joel in a tone of the greatest satisfaction. Then he began to dance again, snapping his brown fingers to keep time. When you come out of that war dance, Joel, said old Mr. King, leaning back in his big chair to laugh at him, perhaps you'll have the goodness to tell me whom you are talking about all this time. Joel stopped his mad career and ran up to the old gentleman's side. Why, Jack Parrish, I thought you knew Grandpapa, he added reproachfully. I suppose I might have known if I'd stopped to consider that you talked to your parish boy every day since the little affair on the pond, said Mr. King, still laughing. Well, and so Mrs. Sterling has invited your friend Joel to some festivity, I suppose, eh? Yes, said Joel, she has, his satisfaction returning. It's a supper at her house tomorrow night, Grandpapa. He leaned over to bring his brown cheek close to the one under the white hair. Just think of that. Woo! Ejaculated the old gentleman. And she hasn't had company for 10 years. Well, she's going to have us, every single one in the comfort committee, declared Joel decidedly. And she asked Jack most particularly, she did, Grandpapa, she really did. May I go down and tell them now? May I, Grandpapa? He cried eagerly. Why, if your mother says so, I suppose, began Mr. King. "She says I may go if you think best," cried Joel, hanging to the arms of the big chair and having hard work to curb his impatience. "Oh, Grandpapa, please hurry and say yes." Instead of complying with this demand, the old gentleman leaned back in his chair and steadily gazed into space while he revolved something in his mind. At last, when Joel thought he couldn't brook the delay another minute, Mr. King whirled suddenly around in his chair. "I tell you what it is, Joel. You and I will go down to see your friend ourselves." "Oh, Grandpapa!" Joel gave a leap and seized Mr. King's arm with both hands. "Right away now?" he cried with sparkling eyes. "Right away now," declared old Mr. King, getting out of his chair. "That is, as soon as we can make ourselves presentable for our walk." "Goodness me, Joe, what a whirlwind you are!" bursting into another laugh. Joel didn't care what he was called, so long as he was really going to see Jack Parrish and carry him the wonderful invitation. And all the way down to the little grocer's on Common Street he just bubbled over with happiness, till everybody who passed the two felt a glow at the heart at the merry comrades. And many were the backward glances cast at the old white-haired gentleman of stately mien, with a chubby-faced boy of the jolliest appearance hanging to his hand. "Well, well, well, and so here we are." Old Mr. King looked up curiously at the little sign above the door. "Ichabod Parrish, grocer." Then down over the shop windows overrunning with canned goods, and to finish up an outside stall on which jostled and overcrowded each other every description of vegetable in the market, from a cabbage down. A fat, red-faced man with a big apron that had been white earlier in the day came out of the shop and stood by the stall. "Anything in our line today, sir?" he said. He had a little pad of paper in one hand and a pencil in the other. "Well, yes," said old Mr. King with a twinkle in his eye, for by this time he perceived some lines along the fat cheeks that showed very plainly the habit of smiles running up and down in them. "I've come for a boy, if you please." "A boy?" said the fat, red-faced man, laughing till the round cheeks were all wrinkled up. "Well, now I take it you're joking, sir." "Oh, no, I'm not," said old Mr. King very seriously. But the other man had been just as observing in his way, and had seen the twinkle in the keen eyes. So now he laughed some more and waited patiently for the joke to be explained. "I take it you have a boy named Jack hereabout?" said Mr. King presently. All the wrinkles dropped suddenly out of the fat, red cheeks. "He hain't done nothing wrong, Jack hain't," gasped the man. "Oh, Grandpapa, tell him what we've come for," cried Joel, twitching Mr. King's hand, and quite aghast to see the suffering in Jack's father. "Do, please, Grandpapa." Old Mr. King was rapidly exclaiming, "No, no, bless you! Did you think I'd come at you in such a way? Why, this boy here," thrusting Joel forward, "has got an invitation for him. Now then, Joel, my boy, speak up." And Joel did speak up. And in a minute they were all there in the little shop, and the fat grocer was bustling around to work a chair out from behind the counter. But as the big store cat and several parcels were on it, it took a bit of time. Meanwhile, old Mr. King sat down upon a box of soap, while Joel hung over his shoulder. A woman came in with a jug to be filled with molasses, and a small girl for a box of matches. But the little grocer told them to wait, and after he had placed the chair and gotten Mr. King off from the soapbox and into it, he bustled to a door at the head of the shop. "Ma!" he cried, putting his head into the room to which it opened. "Do you know where Jack is?" "He's upstairs," said a voice, evidently Ma's. "Well, tell him to come down," said the fat grocer. "All right, Ichabod." "Jack's to home," announced the grocer, coming back with an air of imparting a piece of news, just as much as if every word had not been heard. "Well now, Miss Jones, I'll fill your jug." He took it from her, and she settled herself comfortably during the slow process to watch the stately, white-haired figure in the chair to her heart's content, her example being followed by the small girl who had, of course, been obliged to wait for the box of matches. A pair of feet could be heard coming through the room just mentioned. "I don't know what your pa wants you for," said a woman's voice. "Most likely for an errand." So Jack, free from his sling, for Dr. Fisher had found him surprisingly quick at recovery, bolted through the doorway and into the shop, and without a bit of warning brought up against old Mr. Horatio King and Joel. "Great Scott!" he cried, scared out of his usual shyness. "Yes," said Joel, sociably bobbing his face into Jack's. "I've come to ask you to supper. Mrs. Sterling told me to, most particularly, you know." "Dear me, Joe!" exclaimed old Mr. King. "Do give it to him more slowly." For Jack's head of light hair was wagging from one to the other of the visitors in great distress. "I am," said Joel. "Awful slow, Grandpapa." "It doesn't look much like it," said the old gentleman, bursting into a laugh. The fat grocer over at the molasses barrel looked across anxiously at the group, and for once in his life wished Mrs. Jones, although one of his best customers, anywhere but in his shop. "Well, try again, Joel," said Mr. King. So Joel began once more, and before long Jack Parrish understood, fairly, that Mrs. Sterling had actually invited him to supper on the following night with the Comfort Committee, just as if he were not the son of Ichabod Parrish, the little grocer on Common Street, but were one of the rich boys of Joel Pepper's set. "Pa!" he shouted. He wanted some of his own family to help understand this puzzle. "Do come here." The fat grocer, hearing this cry, could stand it no longer trying to stamp out his curiosity. So, deserting the molasses barrel and forgetting to turn the spigot, he bore off the jug. "There, Miss Jones, there you are," depositing it with a thump on the counter, and waddled over to his son and the visitors. When he comprehended the matter, as after an infinite deal of pains he did, his astonishment knew no bounds. It absolutely struck him speechless. And there he stood in the middle of the little shop, lost to the fact that he was a small grocer on an obscure street. He was the father of Jack, hitherto obliged to go with boys of the neighborhood, not of specially nice families with manners and aims to match. Now, oh joy! With a chance for something better, that might reach to unknown heights. He might even become an alderman. The little grocer's breast heaved with delight, but even in that blissful moment his first thought was of his wife. "Won't your mother be proud, Jack?" he made out to utter. "Your molasses is all running out," proclaimed the small girl who was waiting for the box of matches. And Jack springing to help his father, who bounded to the molasses barrel, old Mr. King and Joel took themselves off without any further embarrassment to the little grocer, who surely could never in all this world express his gratitude as he wanted to. "Be at my house tomorrow afternoon, and we'll go over together," said Joel, with longing glances at the center of bustle around the molasses barrel. "Oh, Grandpapa, how I do wish I could have stayed and helped clean up," Joel burst out as they left the shop. "Oh, my goodness, Joel!" exclaimed old Mr. King. "Such a messy job! How can you?" "It would have been such fun," mourned Joel, wishing he could have free access to just a small grocer shop, and thinking that Jack was the luckiest fellow alive. "When I grow up, I'm going to have a shop like that," he declared, after marching on in silence down the next block and surveying with favor all the surroundings of the narrow street. "I thought you were going to sell tin, like your Mr. Biggs of Badgertown," said Mr. King mischievously. Joel hung his head. "I was, but I think a shop would be nicer after all. You can have everything in it, you know, Grandpa." "Even molasses," put in Mr. King. "Well, I wouldn't decide the matter just now, Joel, my boy. Which you will be when you are grown up. There's plenty of time yet ahead of you." Jack Parrish, with his hair carefully oiled by his anxious mother, and his very best clothes on, a circumstance calculated to invest him with dread and rob him of every bit of comfort to begin with, presented himself at Mr. King's mansion on the next afternoon. His countenance was long, and he looked so worried that Joel, rushing out to meet him, involuntarily ejaculated, "Oh, dear me!" in dismay. After regarding each other uncomfortably for a minute, in which Jack began to wish himself 1,000 times back in the little shop, Joel burst out, seizing his arm. "Come up into my room, Dave's in mine." And over the stairs they went. "Is this your room?" gasped Jack, forgetting his discomfort and staring all about. "Yes, it is," said Joel. "Dave's in mine. See my tennis racket, Jack? Isn't it prime?" darting over to pull it out of a corner. "I should say it was," declared Jack, fingering it lovingly as Joel thrust it into his hand with a, "Do you play?" "A little," said Jack. He did not think it necessary to add that he was the champion player of the Common Street team on the dingy little open space given up to goats and tenement house children. "That's good!" exclaimed Joel with shining eyes, and clapping him on the back. "We'll have a bout together sometime. And here are my boxing gloves." He seized them and struck an attitude. "Come on, Jack," he cried in huge delight. So Jack did come on, and when he emerged, why, there were the fencing foils to try, and when this was all over and both boys sat down flushed and panting, why, Jack's best Sunday go-to meeting clothes and his oiled hair didn't look so badly to Joel's way of thinking. David now ran in. "It's time to get ready to go to Mrs. Sterling's supper," he said, with a nod to Jack. "So it is!" cried Joel, beginning to run here and there for his other shoes and clothes. Jack turned away with a feeling that it wasn't good manners to be looking on, and glanced out of the window. "Come over and look at our butterflies," cried Joel, running over to a cabinet against the wall. "They're just beauties." "Oh, have you collected butterflies?" cried Jack, whirling around, greatly excited. "Yes, Dave and I have," said Joel. "We have lots and lots." It didn't take Jack long to be over in front of the cabinet, and pulling out its many drawers, so that he was lost to all the fuss of dressing that Joel and David were undergoing, and it wasn't till he'd been clapped on the back most vigorously with a "Wake up, old chap!" that he realized the dreadful time had arrived when he must go out to his first company. Then a dreadful feeling came over him. "Why, Mrs. Sterling expects you," began David. Joel had no such gentle ways. "Come along, you," he cried, hauling Jack away from the cabinet and hurrying him off downstairs. Then he began to chatter as hard as he could, saying the first things that came into his head, until the Greystone mansion was reached and they were fast and safe within the door. Joel drew a long breath and began to mount the stairs. "Any boys here yet?" he asked, looking up at Gibson in the upper hall. "Yes," said Gibson. 3 boys have come." Joel didn't wait to ask who they were. He left David to bring Jack along and raced in to speak to Mrs. Sterling and the members of the Comfort Committee. "I am very glad to see you, Joel." Mrs. Sterling beamed at him from her sofa, feeling quite sure of the success of the first company she had given to the boys now that Joel Pepper had come. Joel gave her a bright little nod. Then, remembering himself, he went over to her sofa and stuck out his little brown hand. "I'm glad I've come," he said, bobbing at the same time in great satisfaction to the boys. "Where is your friend Joel?" asked Mrs. Sterling in disappointment. "I surely thought you would bring him." Joel glanced around in dismay, then pranced out into the hall. A scuffling noise struck upon his ear, and leaning over the banister, he saw David and Jack apparently hanging on to each other and whirling around in the hall below. He was down the stairs in a flash. "He says you must go home," said David, still holding fast to the edge of Jack's jacket, and looking up with a very pink face. Jack looked thoroughly ashamed, but he still cast wild eyes at the big front door, as Joel, considering whatever was to be done at all should be done quickly, launched him upstairs, and before he had a moment to breathe freely, pushed him into the beautiful sitting room above with a "Here he is!" The room swam all around before Jack as he went up to the sofa edge, and Mrs. Sterling's soft white hand took his hot, nervous one. He didn't know in the least what she said or how she looked, as he couldn't raise his eyes, but he remembered afterwards that her voice was sweet and low, and that somehow he wasn't so afraid after that. And then Joel dragged him into a knot of boys, for by this time several were pouring into the room. And in 5 minutes Jack felt as if he had known them all for years, and he quite forgot that this was the first time he had ever gone into company. When the bustle of arrival was over, and every member of the Comfort Committee was present, Mrs. Sterling said, "Now I think, Gibson, the first thing we should do is to have supper." So Gibson went over and touched the electric button on the wall, and in came the butler and 2 maids bearing trays full, well, just crowded with all the good things a boy could desire to eat. And these, having been placed on the big mahogany table in the center of the room, usually filled with books and magazines, but which had been cleared for the purpose, each boy was invited to come up and be helped to whatever he wanted, an invitation that wasn't long left unaccepted. Joel, in his fear that Jack would somehow be left out in the cold, bent all his energies towards getting him something to eat. The consequence was that he forgot all about waiting on Mrs. Sterling, and, Glancing around after he had poked a plate of cold chicken and jelly into Jack's hands, he saw 2 or 3 of the boys, Frick, and even little Porter Knapp, vying with each other to be the first to serve their hostess. "Ah!" cried Joel, seizing the first thing on the table that caught his eye. It proved to be the salt cellar, and he rushed up and presented it with a flourish. "Ho, ho!" exploded Frick, as the little knot of boys parted in the middle. "Why, we've only got her a napkin and a plate." Joel glanced down ruefully at the salt cellar in his hand, and was going to beat a retreat with it, quite crestfallen. "Thank you, Joel, I shall want it pretty soon," said Mrs. Sterling, smiling into his red face. "There, we'll put it on the table," for Mrs. Gibson had been busy drawing up a light stand to the side of the sofa. "And will you bring me some cold chicken?" "Me?" cried Joel, perfectly radiant, but scarcely believing that he could be meant after his awkwardness. "Yes, you," said Mrs. Sterling, laughing. "So hurry and get it, Joel." No need to tell him that. Joel sprang at the table again, bore off a plate of the desired delicacy and a spoonful of currant jelly by its side, and flew back again. "Is that all right?" he asked anxiously, with a dreadful feeling that he ought to have asked her if she wanted brown or white meat. "How did you know that I am very fond of white meat, Joel?" asked Mrs. Sterling. "And above all things I like the wing." "Do you?" cried Joel in a transport. "Now what else?" "Nothing now, and the next time, why, I must let Frick and some of the other boys help me," said Mrs. Sterling. "So run back and get something to eat yourself, Joel." So Joel, with a mind to edge up to see how Jack was getting on, found to his amazement that he was laughing and talking with the last boy with whom he would have supposed to be possible, Curtis Park. "Dear me!" exclaimed Joel to himself, tumbling back instinctively when he saw that he wasn't wanted, and he fell up against David. "I couldn't help it," said Davy, who had been quite miserable since his ill success in getting Jack over the stairs after Joel. He was aimlessly crumbling up a biscuit on his plate and eating nothing. "Well, 'tisn't any matter," said Joel. "And he's here now, and having a good time. Just hear him laugh," he added enviously. "Is that Jack laughing?" asked David incredulously, poking his head around the intervening boys to see for himself. "Yes, it is," said Joel, bobbing his head decidedly. "Oh, well, then it's all right," said David happily. So he ran off to fill his plate and go over in the corner to eat its contents with a group of boys with whom he was especially fond. Joel, left alone, was feeling very dismal, when suddenly he looked over and caught Jack's eye. Curtis Park was saying something very jolly. Joel knew it was, for he caught scraps of it, and so did some of the other boys who pushed up to hear the rest. But Jack Parrish evidently didn't listen, for his eye had been anxiously roving around the room, and just at that moment they rested on Joel, and they lighted up so unmistakably that Joel sprang forward, a light in his own. "Did you want me, Jack?" "Yes," said Jack. "I did." The words were not much, but they seemed to satisfy Joel. End of chapter 25. Chapter number 26 of 5 Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kat Sadler. 5 Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. Mr. Hamilton Dice, a True Friend. And after every boy protested that he couldn't eat another bit, the butler and the 2 maids packed up the trays and carried them down again. "Now, Comfort Committee," said Mrs. Sterling, "all draw up here." So the circle of chairs and crickets was made around the sofa, and the real business of the evening began. It was in the very commencement of things Joel noticed that every one of the members seemed to take a fancy to Jack. Curtis Park leaned over from his chair. "I say, Frick, change places with me." Frick was next to the visitor, Joel, of course, being on his other side. "No, you don't," said Frick, not over politely. "Oh, that's mean," began Curtis. Then he remembered where he was and sat back in his chair, biting his pencil. Frick straightened himself up with enjoyment. "You can take my pencil," he said to Jack magnanimously. We all brought 'em, you know. She wanted us to." Joel caught the last of this. "Oh, dear me," he exclaimed in remorse. "I forgot mine. And Jack, I was going to bring one for you." "He can take mine," said Frick, shoving a very stubby specimen into Jack's hand. "Mine's better," said Curtis, reaching over a brand new one, just sharpened to a fine point. "Take mine, Jack. You much better." Jack, not knowing how to refuse, took it. And the other boys, seeing Curtis Park come down from his high-flown notions enough to notice so conspicuously the new boy, all began to find ever so many things in him that were worthy of their attention. So instead of Joel having to push him along, Jack became quite popular. The result was that Joel was left out in the cold. "Now," said Mrs. Sterling brightly, after a little of this chat had been going on and Gibson had shaken up her pillows and raised her mistress into a more comfortable position, "you all know, of course, that Dr. Fisher reports Lawrence ready for a little amusement, if we send it to him, for no one is allowed yet to see him." "But we will soon. Dr. Fisher told my father so yesterday," piped out Porter Knapp, sliding to the edge of his chair. "I don't doubt it," said Mrs. Sterling, smiling at him. "But until that good time does come, why, we who belong to the Comfort Committee ought to set to work on something that will cheer him up. And as I believe work of that kind always get along better when ever so many club together at it, why, I thought I'd ask you all to meet here, and we'd see what could be done this evening. Now, what shall we do first?" She looked all around the circle, but no one spoke. "Oh, dear me," she said, and her face fell. "I'd rather write out conundrums than anything else," said Curtis Park, seeing some answer was expected. "Good." Mrs. Sterling beamed on him. "Does any other boy have something to propose?" "Puzzles," said Frick decidedly. "I'd a great deal rather have puzzles. Conundrums are just horrid." "Two things to choose from," and Mrs. Sterling laughed. Her spirits were rising now, and all the doubt she was beginning to feel overwhelming her as to the wisdom of inviting these boys in for the evening fled at once. "I think puzzles are just as horrid as conundrums," said Joel Pepper, beginning already to feel the prickles run up and down his legs from sitting still so long, and wishing for nothing so much as a good scamper. "They're both as horrid as can be." "Oh, Joel!" exclaimed Mrs. Sterling, quite crestfallen. "Well, propose something yourself then, Joe," said his next neighbor with a nudge. "Oh, I can't," said Joel, quite horrified. "I don't know anything that we can write down." Jack leaned over and whispered in his ear. "The very thing!" cried Joel, slapping his knee. And, "Tell it yourself, Jack," in the next breath. "Oh, no, no," protested Jack, shrinking as far back in his chair as he could, and getting very red in the face. "I very much wish you would, Jack," said Mrs. Sterling. And she looked at him in such a way that Jack, although he had wild thoughts of taking a flying leap out of his chair and off to the small grocery shop, nevertheless stuck to it manfully, and at last found his tongue. "We might cut out pictures that spell the names of books," he said. "Capital!" said Mrs. Sterling. "Well, those are puzzles," said Frick. "Well, not like the ones you meant," said Joel, leaning back of Jack to bestow a punch. "Do be still," he added furiously. "But mine would be puzzles anyway," declared Frick, unwilling to give up the point. "Well, we'd much rather have these anyway," said Curtis Park, projecting himself into as much of the circle as possible. "Who cares for your old puzzles, Frick?" "Boys, boys," said Mrs. Sterling gently. "Beg pardon," said Curtis, "but we really do want these that Jack has just proposed, Mrs. Sterling." "At least, I do. And I'd give up the conundrums to have them, so please let us have these." "How is it, Frick?" asked Mrs. Sterling. "Do you give up your puzzles in favor of our making Jack's pictures?" Frick wriggled in his chair. He wanted his puzzles dreadfully, and he couldn't see, since he had proposed them first, why he shouldn't carry the day. But every boy was looking at him sharply, so he mumbled, "Yes." It was Jack who settled it happily after all. Let's have one of his, bobbing his head at Frick, and a conundrum, and he looked over and smiled at Curtis. Then one of mine after that. Won't that do, ma'am? Well now, Jack, you've fixed it cleverly, said Mrs. Sterling, much relieved. Get your pencils all ready while Gibson goes into my bedroom and brings out the pile of magazines, and we'll have such a lovely evening of work. You know you must each select pictures, and each write a puzzle, and each give a conundrum. Then they must be read aloud, and we will choose the very best ones to send. Now then, as Gibson deposited her armful of magazines on the little stand and laid several pairs of scissors on top of the pile, let us all set about it. Then what a whirling of leaves and snipping of paper, because they all decided they would begin on Jack's first. Can't we have some mucilage? Asked Joel. Yes, indeed, said Mrs. Sterling. Gibson, will you? Boom, 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 clang, clang, clang. It was the fire bell, loud and clear and strong. Down went all the scissors, and a whole litter of papers to the floor, and the magazines sprawled every way as each boy sprang out of his chair. Gibson, said Mrs. Sterling faintly. Now, you boys, cried Gibson, hurrying in, her cap strings flying in her perturbation. Don't you know better than to jump up like that? Gibson, Gibson, said Mrs. Sterling reprovingly, but she laid her hand on her heart. It's a fire! Cried Joel, with very red cheeks, whirling around from the window where the mass of boys was pressed. Well, is that any reason why you should act so and scare the mistress to death? Said Gibson sharply. We didn't scare her, said Joel bluntly. It was the fire. Well, we must go, declared little Porter Knapp, struggling out from the knot of boys who, all bigger and stronger, were pinning him against the window most uncomfortably. Oh, he mustn't, Mrs. Sterling said in alarm. His father wouldn't like it at all. He was to stay here until he was sent for. It's a fire! Exclaimed Porter, kicking dreadfully, and his face getting red. And I shall go! The other boys, just on the edge of saying the same thing, now stood quite still. Every nerve was quivering to be off to the fire, which, from all appearances, must be a splendid one. The bells were clanging fast and furiously. Hoarse cries were heard, as if raised from hundreds of throats. And now, to add to the general melee, an engine dashed around the corner. They could hear the mad plunge of the horses, the shouts of the people, and then off in the distance, yet approaching nearer each instant, was another and evidently a more powerful one, the horses at a mad gallop. It was too much for any boy to stand. You see, we must go. Curtis Park went over to the sofa and said this hoarsely. He's a baby, pointing to Porter, and he's got to stay here, but we big boys must go. Mrs. Sterling looked up and her face grew white. But your fathers wouldn't wish you to go, I'm quite sure, she said. Curtis turned away his face, but his teeth were set. I'm going, he said briefly. Jack Parrish's head spun, and he clenched his hands. Why had he come to this sick woman's house? If he were only out there in the free, open air, he'd go in a flash. His father let him run to fires, and it wouldn't be many minutes before he'd be in the thick of it. He'd make a break and run. But how white she looked as she laid her head on the pillow. Like it or not, there he was in her house, an invited guest, and she'd been so kind to him and sent him the first invitation he'd ever had. He opened his hard fists and closed them tighter than ever. Curtis Park was now at the head of the stairs. Having decided, he was bolting off. Little Porter Knapp was engaged in kicking Gibson, who was detaining him by the end of his jacket, and screaming wrathfully and slapping her hands. The other boys, most of them making up their minds to follow Curtis, were watching proceedings. Jack strode off to Curtis. See here, he said. We ought not to go, don't you know? Curtis turned on him in a towering passion. You let me alone, you grocer's boy, you! What business is it of yours? I may be a grocer's boy, said Jack, feeling himself wonderfully cool as the other's anger raged. But I know something of good manners, perhaps, and we're scaring that lady to death. Curtis Park was dreadfully proud of his manners, and he would have stopped there, but as it again occurred to him that this was the son of a grocer, who was setting up to be an authority, he cried angrily, You're a great one to teach me manners." And he dashed down the stairs and was out of the house. "I wish I'd stopped him," said Jack to himself. "Hello, here's the whole mob," as all the boys except Joel and David, and of course Porter, now plunged out to do the same thing. "No, you don't." He squared up in front of the staircase. "Not one of you goes down there." They brought up with a gasp. At that instant a cheery voice in the hall below rang out. "Hello, boys. I knew you were to be here tonight. Don't you want to come with me to the fire?" It was Hamilton Dyce to whom the voice belonged. And in 5 minutes Hamilton Dyce set forth, with Mrs. Sterling's complete approval, a string of boys in his wake, including little Porter, who was parted from Gibson only on her hearing her mistress say, "Yes, indeed, he can go, but do look out for him." Mr. Dyce nodded over to her couch. "Come on, you little rascal," to Porter. "You stick close to me, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. Gibson, pale and shaking in every limb, but seeing no reason to regret that she had clung on to little Porter's jacket, sank into a chair and simply looked at her mistress. "Nevertheless," said Mrs. Sterling with a long breath, and beginning to smile, "I am very glad those boys were here to supper." If her mistress could smile, it wasn't so very black and dreadful after all, and Gibson came enough out of her gloom to mutter, "But look at this room," and she waved her hands in despair. "Oh, that's nothing," said Mrs. Sterling cheerfully, and then she laughed outright as she glanced around at the effects of the tumult. "Gibson, come here a minute." The old serving woman crept out of her chair and went over to the sofa. "Do you know?" Mrs. Sterling took her arm and pulled her gently down to a level with the face on the pillow, and her soft eyes twinkled. "It really seems good to see such a muss for once in my life. You do keep me so immaculately fine, Gibson." "Oh, mistress," breathed Gibson aghast. "And to think I have had boys, actually young life, here in this room." Mrs. Sterling raised herself suddenly to rest on one elbow. "Mistress, mistress," implored the alarmed Gibson, with restraining hands. "You'll hurt yourself." "No, I shan't," protested Mrs. Sterling, her eyes beaming and going on resolutely. "And just to think of the boys being here!" She looked around the room with a sudden affection. "And liking it! For they did, Gibson. They surely did until the fire started. Oh, it is perfectly beautiful." "Well, do lie back, mistress," begged Gibson, thumping up the pillows invitingly. "Else those dreadful creatures will finish you entirely." "Don't say so!" cried Mrs. Sterling laughingly. "And I will be good." And she settled back comfortably into her accustomed place. "Yes, Gibson, I have my young folks now, the same as other people," she added proudly. "You needn't try to fix up the room yet. You may finish the story you were reading to me last night." She had to turn her face on the pillow, for the smile would come at the picture of Gibson, the immaculate, sitting down calmly in the midst of the awful effects of the tumult that had so vexed her soul. She had her young people. There was no manner of doubt after that, and though the exit from their evening's excitement was not again made to the clang of the fire bell, all the subsequent visits held fun and jollity and quiet enjoyment and everything else that was delightful mixed up together. And the Comfort Committee had so much pleasure out of the whole thing that one evening little Porter looked up from his laborious pasting, whereby a joke from the funny paper was going down for the sick boy's amusement. "I wish someone else would get hurt," he said abruptly without stopping to think. "Oh, you beggar!" It was Curtis Park who turned on him, though every boy had glanced up in surprise. "We can't have such fun," said Porter, waving his sticky hands in both directions, "unless they do." And he twisted uncomfortably in his chair as he realized the effect of his words. "Well, we must think of somebody else to help with our Comfort Committee," said Mrs. Sterling from her sofa. "Don't worry, Porter. We won't let ourselves die out for want of work. Boys!" She looked at them suddenly, raising herself on her elbow. Gibson over in her watchful corner, trotting across in great apprehension. Mistress, she began. "There are ever so many young people who are hurt and sick and distressed and are taken right out of life." She was gazing at them now with eyes that were large and dark and shining. "But we don't know them!" burst out Joel Pepper, for she seemed to expect somebody to answer. "No, but they need you." Mistress, begged Gibson, hanging over her. And if you do the work after Lawrence doesn't need it, and he is here with us, well and happy once more, I will see that some sick or unhappy boy gets it." Joel Pepper hopped out of his chair, upsetting the mucilage bottle, seeing which, Gibson left her mistress to reach the table in time to save a disaster. "Will you? Will you?" he cried, running over to the sofa. "Will you give our things if we make them to some poor sick boys who are hurt, Mrs. Sterling?" "I surely will, Joel," promised Mrs. Sterling, taking his 2 brown hands in her thin one. "Then I am going to make things," declared Joel, who had never in his life before been willing to sit still and cut out and snip and paste and write, and he plunged back to his seat. "Oh!" he cried in dismay, and his face grew terribly red. "Did I upset that?" pointing to the mucilage bottle. "You surely did," said Gibson tartly, and taking up the last of the sticky mess with a wet towel. "And I suppose you'll do it again, or some of the rest of you boys will. It doesn't make a difference which." And she moved off slowly. "Gibson, Gibson," said Mrs. Sterling gently. "Oh, Gibson!" Joel flew after her and twitched her apron string. "What is it?" She turned on him with such asperity. "I will never upset the mucilage bottle again. I won't, Gibson, really." "See that you don't," replied Gibson, moving off with small faith in such promises. Another promise had that very evening been made, just before the boys had gathered in Mrs. Sterling's handsome sitting room. Curtis Park had been through several spasms of distress over his attack on Jack, when, whirling about from the friendly attitude he had chosen to assume, he had made a tirade on the grocer's son. Look at it whichever way he might, it didn't seem pleasant to view. And all the delight in the fire and companionship of Mr. Dyce, of whom all the boys were exceedingly fond, was suddenly blotted out. He went home that night and crept into bed a most disconsolate boy. "I was a beastly cad," he fumed, kicking the covering down to the foot and rolling out with the vain attempt to find some diversion. But that being impossible, he tumbled in again with his unhappy thoughts. And all through the following days, go whichever way he might, there was the fact to stare him in the face, that he, Curtis Park, who had hitherto prided himself upon his fine manners, had dropped from his height to blackguard a boy who, despite the fact of having been born the son of a little grocer on Common Street, had yet shown himself capable of the height. "It's no use to deny it. I've been a bully and a cad," he groaned, and wiped the perspiration from his face. "What can I do?" There was only one way, and he knew it, just as well at first as after all the fencing with himself that ensued the next few days. And at last, on this very evening, he stopped fighting the idea, and marched up to what it suggested, like a man. "See here, will you, though I shouldn't think you'd want to speak to me." It was a boy who said this to Jack standing on the step of the grocer's front door next to the shop. "Hey?" said Jack in a great bewilderment. Was that really Curtis Park, whose rap on the door had announced him? "Oh, it's no use to deny, Jack," said Curtis, speaking rapidly and desperately, "that I've been a cad, a mean, low cad, to talk to you in that way. It's done, and can't be helped now. I only want you to know what I think of it." Jack swallowed hard. He was going to put out his hand, but luckily thought in time. "This is Curtis Park." "I don't wonder you won't shake hands with me," said Curtis, who saw the movement. "I'm no end sorry, and perhaps sometime, Jack, why, you will." Jack's brown hand shot out so swiftly it nearly knocked the other boy from the doorstep. "It's all right," he said heartily. "And you will never have another chance to call me a cad, I promise you," declared Curtis, ringing it. "Come on now, Jack," hooking him by the arm. "It's time to go to Mrs. Sterling's. This is the evening, you know." And the boys, who had begun to think they had made a mistake in supposing that Curtis Park had taken a fancy to Jack Parrish, were pushed back into their first conviction by seeing them come into the meeting of the Comfort Committee arm in arm. End of chapter number 26. Chapter 27 of Five Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kat Sadler. Five Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. A piece of good news. Polly Pepper ran down the steps of Miss Taylor's house and set off at a lively pace on the pavement. Presently she came to an abrupt stop. "Oh, how could I forget? Mamsie wouldn't like me to run in the street," she thought remorsefully, and this took away some of the glad little thrills running over her. When she got to Mrs. Cummings' very select boarding house on the avenue, there was Miss Reese at the window of her room, looking up from her embroidery. When she saw Polly Pepper, she smiled. "Oh, it's you, Polly. I'm glad to see you." "Is Alexia there?" called Polly, looking up and feeling her lovely bit of news dancing within her again, so that she could hardly control her impatience. "Do tell her to come out, please, Miss Reese." "She isn't here. She went downtown." Miss Reese laid her precious work in her lap and put her face close to the window screen. "Her candy wasn't a success, and she's gone down for more confectioner's sugar." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Polly, quite gone in distress over the failure of the candy, and feeling very helpless in the fact that there was no one to tell her news to. For, of course, Alexia must be the first one to hear it. "Which way did she go, Miss Reese?" lifting a troubled face to the window above. "I don't know," said Miss Reese absently, her mind on her embroidery and very much wishing she could return to it. "She was going to your house, I know, for one thing, on her way down." "Oh, she couldn't have gone there," cried Polly, "for I should have met her on the way." "So you would," assented Alexia's aunt, wondering whether the bunch of grapes should be filled in solid or worked with the mixed stitch that she had seen in a shop. "Well, then, I think on her way back she was going to see you, Polly." "Then I am going to run down and meet her," declared Polly with a long breath. "Was it Pensie's where she was going for the sugar, Miss Reese?" pausing a moment. "Yes," said Miss Reese, turning back with a sigh of relief to her embroidery again, while Polly hurried off, wishing that she was a boy, when it would be quite proper for her to run through the streets. "Oh, if it were only Badgertown," she sighed to herself, thinking of the many happy runs she had enjoyed down the lane to Grandma Bascom's cottage, or over across the fields to the parsonage. "Dear me," went a voice. "Polly Pepper, Polly Pepper," called after her. She looked back, and there, with the window screen up and her face thrust well forward, was Alexia's aunt, loudly summoning her. When she saw that Polly heard and had turned back, she beckoned smartly with her long fingers, on which shone, as Alexia had once said, all the rings the Reese family had ever owned, drew in her head, and waited till Polly came up under the window again. "Oh, Polly, it's just this. How fortunate you hadn't gotten far. I want to tell you Alexia to get me some more green floss at Miss Angel's." "Yes, Miss Reese," said Polly, with a dismayed remembrance just how far it was to the little shop where the very latest patterns and materials for fancy work could be obtained. And the first supper of the cooking club was to be given tonight. "I want you to tell Alexia to get me some more green floss at Miss Angel's." "Yes, Miss Reese," said Polly, with a dismayed remembrance just how far it was to the little shop where the very latest patterns and materials for fancy work could be obtained, and the first supper of the cooking club to be given tonight. "And stay, Miss Angel may send me up some more patterns to choose from, that is, if she has had any new ones since I was there last week, and I presume that she has." Polly could only utter, "Yes, Miss Reese," so very faintly it could scarcely be heard. Dear me, and it was 3 o'clock already, and all that candy was to be made over again. She crept off on very dismal feet, till she reflected it wouldn't help matters any to lose heart, and so she set forward at a brisk pace again. Miss Reese pushed down the window screen and set to work with a complacent smile at the prospect of having her errand performed so nicely. "That's the good of having young people around," she said. "It's so convenient at times to get one's errands done." Polly went the whole length of North Street to the great establishment of Pensie's, where the Avenue people traded. But search as she might up one aisle and down another, there was no trace of Alexia. And inquiring of a clerk at the sugar department, if she had been there, he'd whipped his pencil out from behind his ear and picked up his order pad before he stopped to think. "She's just gone," he said. "Yes, madam?" All attention to the next customer. Polly hurried on rapid feet. It was 3:30 by the big central clock as she went down the main aisle. Well, she must hurry home, for Alexia was probably on her way there, as Miss Reese had said when "Dear me, Polly Pepper, wait!" struck her ear. She turned, and there before an opposite corner was Alexia, picking up her package of sugar and preparing to race after her. "I'm getting some more nuts," she said. "My candy was perfectly horrid, and everything was spoiled." "Yes, I know," said Polly, coming up close to comfort as much as possible, for Alexia had a very long face on, and looked as if it would take a good deal to cheer her up. "How can I tell her about that dreadful green floss and those patterns?" said Polly over and over to herself. "I must wait till we get out on the street." But when the two girls were outside the shop, Polly carrying the bundle of nuts tucked under her arm, it was just as bad, and she put it off until the corner was reached down to where they must turn to go to Miss Angel's. But when the two girls were outside the shop, Polly carrying the bundle of nuts tucked under her arm, it was just as bad, and she put it off until the corner was reached down which they must turn to go to Miss Angel's. And worst of all, they were hurrying on so fast the lovely bit of news must be postponed. "How glad I am Aunt didn't take it into her head to send me spinning off down there," observed Alexia, glancing down the long thoroughfare with anything but a pleasant expression on her face. "I just hate that Miss Angel's shop. Goodness me! We never could do it, with all this candy to make, and get our club supper tonight." Polly stopped short and seized Alexia's arm. "Oh, don't feel badly," she gasped. And then thinking, "It's better to have the whole out at once," she finished in one breath. "Your aunt wants some green floss, Alexia." "Well, she shan't have it," declared Alexia, stopping short too, and glaring at Polly over her bundle of sugar. "No, indeed." And her pale eyes grew very angry. "The very idea! She's always wanting green floss every single minute. Come on, Polly Pepper." She set her face straight ahead and marched on, but not hearing Polly following, she looked over her shoulder and then ran back. "Why don't you come on? I shan't get that old green floss," all in one breath. "We can get there in a few minutes, perhaps," said Polly. "Alexia, do let us hurry." And turning down the corner without so much as a glance backward, she went swiftly on without trusting herself to look down the long street. "I shan't get that old green floss," declared Alexia wrathfully, standing quite still on the corner, yet as Polly kept steadily on, showing no intention of stopping, she pattered after. But she kept saying every step of the way, "I shan't get that old green floss. Polly, wait!" But it was not until the door of Miss Angel's shop was reached that the two girls came together. "It's a hateful, mean shame!" exploded Alexia, huddling up her bundle of sugar passionately. "There! I've punched a hole with my thumb. See what you've made me do?" Polly turned around in dismay to see a little trail of fine sugar drifting from the package down over Alexia's gown. "Oh, dear me!" she exclaimed in dismay. "I'll help you. Stand still, Alexia, do. It's all running out." "Well, you made me!" cried Alexia, whirling around and wildly patting the bag in just the wrong places, so that the stream of sugar became now quite big. "Do stand still, Alexia," implored Polly. "Here, I'll pinch it up." She set down her bundle of nuts on the top step, which a lady, not seeing, came out of the shop and promptly fell over. "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Polly in terror and running down the steps. "Did I hurt you? Oh, I'm so sorry!" clasping her hands and looking the picture of distress. Then she saw it was Mrs. Patterson, a friend of Aunt Whitney's. "No," said the lady tartly, getting up to her feet to draw a long breath and gaze up and down the street. "Why, Polly Pepper," bringing her gaze upon the flushed face. "Are you sure you were not hurt, Mrs. Patterson?" Polly looked at her anxiously. Oh, dear me, how could she be so careless? "Not a bit of it," declared the lady. "But oh, Polly, do you suppose anyone saw me?" And she gazed ruefully up and down the street again. "I don't believe anyone did," said Polly, peering this way and that. "Polly, do come, the sugar is all running away," cried Alexia loudly. "And do let me brush your gown," implored Polly, feeling as if everything were going wrong this afternoon. "Never mind, I'm going directly home. Here's the carriage," said Mrs. Patterson, as her handsome equipage drew up. "Don't you worry a bit, Polly Pepper. I'm not in the least hurt." And off she drove. "Polly, will you come?" called Alexia, dancing about impatiently on the top step and clutching the bag of sugar with nervous ringers that didn't help matters any. "Oh dear me, do look," pointing tragically to the little pile of sweetness at her feet. "Oh, I do hope she wasn't hurt," cried Polly, stumbling up over the steps. How she didn't know. "Oh, that tiresome Mrs. Patterson. Well, it will do her good to tumble down once in a while," said Alexia unsympathetically. "She's so stiff and mighty, and I think you might pay some attention to me," she cried in a loud, injured tone. "I'm all in a mess with the sugar, and I haven't got any candy, and you made me come clear down to this old shop and—" "Well, do come in," cried Polly, interrupting her stream of complaint, and, picking up the bag of nuts before anyone else could tumble over it, she hurried Alexia into the little shop. "And I'm glad enough to get where I can lay this old thing down," declared Alexia, dumping the bag of sugar upon the first resting place she saw, an aesthetic little lounge covered with elaborately embroidered pieces. "Oh me, my arms are almost broken," and she stretched them restfully. "And besides, the sugar is most all run out." "Oh, Alexia!" cried Polly, quite aghast, as she saw where Alexia had deposited the sugar, just as the proprietor of the shop hurried up with dismay written all over her countenance. "Oh, my beautiful centerpieces!" she exclaimed, raising both hands in dismay. "I am sure they are quite ruined." "It's nothing but sugar," grumbled Alexia as she huddled up her bundle again. "And I'll brush it all off," said Polly anxiously, bestowing little pats over the various specimens of fancy work. "See, Miss Angel, I don't believe it's hurt," she said, lifting her flushed face. "Well, I don't wish them," declared two ladies together, coming back from the small table, where they had gone to examine more work. "They are quite mused and tumbled now," added one, "and not at all what we want. Come, sister." And she walked to the door, viewing with disfavor Alexia and her bundle, and Polly Pepper as well. Miss Angel's face dropped to such a length that Polly couldn't bear to look at it. "Oh, please don't go," cried Polly, flying after the irate customer. "I don't really believe the pretty things are hurt. Do just come back and see, please." The other lady was standing irresolutely by the lounge, but she wouldn't even look at the centerpieces that Miss Angel was smoothing out with a despairing hand, preparing to put them into their boxes again. "It was clean sugar," Polly ran on, feeling quite sure if she stopped talking that all hope was lost. "But they are mused," began the lady by the door very decidedly. Alexia was huddling up her bundle, quite gone in despair, and lost to all the distress of having no candy to take to the cooking club supper. If those two ladies would only buy the centerpieces they had selected, it was all she hoped for in this world. "No, indeed. Come, sister," and she opened the door. "Why, Mrs. Alexander!" Mrs. Alexander, a portly person with a great deal of black jet and lace, that seemed to be always catching in the apparel of those who passed her, worked her way into the small shop, and up past the knot of people, giving friendly nods of recognition on her way. "How do you do, Miss Ellicott, Miss Juliana? How are you, Polly, and Alexia? How is your aunt?" And without waiting for a reply, she sprang, if such a ponderous body could be said to spring, at the box of centerpieces Miss Angel was packing away. Oh, how beautiful! Stop!" laying her large hand on one. "Just what I want. How much is it?" $15, said Miss Angel, whipping it neatly out of the box, her dismal frown becoming an expansive smile. "Yes, it is a beauty, one of the very latest things." And she spread it forth on the lounge with an experienced little nourish. Miss Ellicott deserted the door and hurried over to the lounge. I'll, as she tried to work herself in between. But the portly Mrs. Alexander had no idea of being interrupted at such an important crisis in life when centerpieces were to be decided upon. So she loudly kept in on her bargaining. "I'll take it," she said in her most decided fashion. "And the next one, too, I fancy. Let me see that." "But that is," gasped Miss Juliana, threading her way into the group, "the very one that I liked." "Eh?" said Mrs. Alexander, looking up with the acute eye of a bargain hunter. "I don't wonder you like it. It's a beauty. Yes, I'll take it also. How much did you say it was, Miss Angel?" Miss Angel, who hadn't said, saw no reason why she shouldn't now make it any price that appealed to her better judgment. $20, she answered, clapping on a cool third of its price. and Mrs. Alexander, who cared very little what she paid for it, beamed at her and said, "Put them in a box and send it out to my carriage. They are the handsomest things I've seen for a long time, and so wonderfully cheap. And you are quite right. They are beauties." "If you've done as I wanted you to," cried Miss Juliana, the tears of vexation gathering in her eyes, as she saw the now incomparable bits of fancy work borne off before their very faces. "You wouldn't have stopped for such a trifle as a few crumbs of sugar, sister." Miss Ellicott's face was very red, but she knew better than to show the chagrin she felt, to add to the delight of the purchaser over her bargain, so she contented herself with saying as she stalked to the door, "You said you didn't want them, Juliana, the same as I did." "But I wasn't so set about it," said Miss Juliana, with a regretful glance at the box, now gaily tied up by the jubilant Miss Angel and delivered into the hands of the little errand girl to be given to the Alexander footman. "And I'm sure if you hadn't insisted, I should have seen that they weren't hurt." "Well, do come on now, Juliana," said her sister sharply, in all the anguish of having the whole blame deposited upon her person. "Since the things are gone, what is the use of talking about the matter?" as they disappeared out of the shop. Polly and Alexia, therefore, had to wait for all this confusion and excitement to clear away before the green floss could be bought and the message from Miss Reese as to the patterns could be given. Meanwhile, Polly was tying up the package of sugar and patting the shrunken paper bag into shape over the hole. "You tell your aunt," said Miss Angel, her cheeks quite flushed with elation over her good bargain, "that I haven't any more patterns come in since she was here. Yes, Mrs. Alexander," to that lady with her head over a drawer deep in a hunt for more bargains, "there's some exquisite design among those. There's the floss," bunching it up hurriedly into a wad, and speaking all in one breath. "Would you mind, Miss Alexia, doing this up yourself?" pointing to the white tissue paper on the table. Alexia, who didn't mind anything so long as she could get out of the shop, twisted up the floss into a wad of the paper. "Do hurry, Polly," she cried, and scampered out to the street, Polly following with her bag of nuts. "Oh dear, I've forgotten that tiresome old bundle of sugar after all," she cried, prancing back. "I'll carry it, and you take the nuts," said Polly, cramming her bundle into the long arms and getting anxious fingers on the bag of sugar as Alexia came running up with it. "I'm sure I wish you would," said Alexia, seizing the nuts delightedly. "I just hate that old Polly Pepper, it's 4:00, as the church bell on St. Stephen's Tower pealed out. So Polly didn't have a chance after all to tell her glad piece of news until they were at the club supper, which was to be given at Larry Keep's to celebrate his getting well. "Oh, Alexia," she was guilty of whispering, "it's the most splendid thing." "Isn't it?" cried Alexia in the greatest satisfaction, glancing over the room where the dish was being passed about eagerly. "To think I got it done after all our fright, and it's the best candy I ever made," glancing over the room where the dish was being passed about eagerly. "Yes, I know," said Polly carelessly, "but this is much better than candy, Alexia, that I mean." "Much better than candy," echoed Alexia, laying down the slice of sponge cake that Clem had made on her plate, and peering around into Polly's face. "What do you mean, Polly Pepper? There can't anything possibly be better than candy." "Yes, there can," contradicted Polly, twisting in delight on her chair. "And you'll say so when you hear it. It's the most beautiful thing that could have possibly happened, Alexia Reese. It's—" And just then the door opened, and in walked Miss Mary Taylor and Mr. Hamilton Dyce, and the first glance that Alexia took of their faces she guessed the whole thing. "Polly!" she gasped, seizing Polly's arm. "You don't mean that our Miss Mary is going to marry Mr. Dyce?" "Yes, I do," said Polly happily. "Mean just that very thing, Alexia." "I don't believe it," declared Alexia, while all the time she knew it was true by their radiant faces. "Well, it is true as can be," said Polly, "for she told me so this very afternoon at her house." "And you've known it all this time?" cried Alexia, for the first time in her life in a passion at Polly, "and never told me at all?" "Oh, Alexia, how could I?" cried Polly in an aggrieved little voice. "For we were in such a perfectly dreadful scrape over getting ready for the supper. How could I, Alexia?" She turned such a miserable face that Alexia made haste to say, "You couldn't, you sweet thing, you," and gave her a reassuring hug. "Well, just look at Mr. Dyce and hear him laugh." And Mr. Hamilton Dyce, being unable to keep his delight within bounds, and seeming to think it incumbent upon himself to take the young people into his confidence, just coolly announced it. And then there was no more paying attention to the cakes and the little biscuits, the custard and the whipped cream, and even Alexia's nut candy went begging. And Miss Mary had to sit in the center of each group of boys and girls a few minutes at a time, for the supper was passed around on trays till Mr. Dice said he wished he hadn't told the news until the feast was ended. And after that, when they all finished up the evening festivities with a dance, why, everyone there tried to get her for first partner. But it was Alexia who swept them all one side. "She's my Sunday school teacher," she declared, "and I shall have her first." "Well, so she is our Sunday school teacher," cried half a dozen of the girls at once as they crowded up. "Well, she's my very dearest friend, that is, except Polly Pepper," said Alexia positively. "Come, Miss Mary," hanging obstinately to her hand, which shone a new ring with a big bright gem in it. "Well, you said Miss Salisbury was," Pickering Dodge on the fringe of the circle of girls couldn't help saying. "Oh, well, I mean Miss Mary is my very dearest friend after that," said Alexia coolly, tossing him a saucy glance as she bore off her beloved Sunday school teacher down the whole length of Mrs. Keep's drawing-room floor. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of Five Little Peppers and Their Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Allison. Five Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney. The Little Stone Cupboard. Phronsie ran down the hall. "Oh, Mamsie," she cried, hurrying into Mrs. Fisher's room. "Grandpapa says she is coming. She really is." She clasped her hands and stood quite still in front of her mother. "Who, dear?" asked Mrs. Fisher absently. She was standing over by the window with one of Phronsie's pinafores in her hand, and wondering if any more were needed to carry her through the summer. "She really is, Mamsie," said Phronsie, very much disappointed that her mother didn't seem to notice. Then her mouth drooped, and she gave a long sigh. Mrs. Fisher tore her mind off from the pinafores and looked down quickly. "Well, I declare, child," and she took her in her arms. "Now then," she put the pinafore in a chair and herself in another. Then she drew Phronsie into her lap. "Tell Mother all about it," she said. "Yes," said Phronsie, "I will," snuggling in great satisfaction up against her mother's neck. "You see, my little girl is really coming. Grandpapa said so." "Oh, yes, Rachel." "Yes." Phronsie bobbed her yellow head, then took it up from its resting place in her mother's neck to peer up into the face above. "And she'll be my little girl all the time she is here. And I must get Clorinda fixed this very minute," she added, dreadfully excited. And, her news all told, Phronsie clambered down from Mrs. Fisher's lap and scurried off. And in a few minutes everybody knew all over the house that the letter had come, in which the invitation for Rachel's visit had been accepted by Miss Parrott. Moreover, she was to arrive on the following day. "Whoop-de-la!" sang Joel, who very much liked Rachel, for she was always ready to play anything that he proposed, and was a perfect adept in climbing trees and inventing a circus out of small material. "Now that's just prime. I wish she was coming to-day." Van and Percy, just as well pleased, ran hither and yon, very much excited. "What shall we do to show her we are glad she's coming?" asked Percy, who seized every chance that offered itself to celebrate such events. "Why, she'll see it," said Joel, pounding away lustily. He was mending his tennis racket. "Wickets! I most split that," holding it up ruefully. "Mrs. Fisher told you not to say that," cried Van, who dearly loved to bring Joel up for correction. "Well, I didn't mean—" Joel whirled around on him. "And I guess you'd say it if you most split your racket so." "She told you not to," repeated Van, knowing his power in holding to that simple statement. "Well, I didn't mean to, I tell you," cried Joel loudly, and very red in the face. "And she won't like it," said Van, delighted to see the effect of his words. Joel's face worked, and he flung the broken racket across the room. It fell with a crash, and he ran over to the bed, hopped into the middle of it, and buried his face in his brown hands, his shoulders in distress. "I didn't mean— Go away!" he screamed, kicking as hard as he could. Van, terribly frightened at the storm he had raised, stood perfectly still in the middle of the room. "There now, I hope you're satisfied," said Percy from the other side. "See what you've done? I guess you'll catch it, Van Whitney," he added pleasantly. Van, not so much worried over what he would catch as terrified about Joel, ran over to his brother. "Oh, do stop him," he implored, seizing Percy's hand. "I can't stop him," said Percy. "You know yourself it's silly to ask me that." "I must then," cried Van, scurrying over to the foot of the bed. "Joel, do stop," he begged frantically. "Go away!" screamed Joel, kicking lustily. "I didn't mean to say it. Oh, dear me! Mamsie, Mamsie!" he blubbered, rolling from side to side on the neat white bed. "I guess he's going to have a fit," said Percy cheerfully, coming up to view matters at a safe distance from the flying feet. At this Van's distress knew no bounds, and, regardless of all possible danger to himself, he ran around the bed and flung himself upon it to burrow close to Joel's stubby black head. "Joe, don't!" he cried, bursting into tears and hugging him with both frantic arms. Joel wriggled and screamed, "Go away!" and kicked more than ever. But Van held on sturdily, and together the two boys rolled over and over across the bed, back and forth, till their breath gave out. "Oh, just look what you are doing!" exclaimed Percy, prancing up and down the room. He had started 2 or 3 times to run out and call Mrs. Fisher, then thought better of it. "You've mussed the bedspread all up, and only look at those shams!" hanging over the footboard in extreme dismay. Hearing these last words, both boys rolled apart and thrust up their heads, to gaze at the details in question. There they were, spick and span as usual at the top, but the lower parts were all mussed and wrinkled, while the lace at one end hung down in a small tag. "Oh, dear me!" cried Joel, huddling up to Van, to throw his arm around his neck. "Just see what I've done!" "Oh, you didn't do it, I did," said Van, giving Joel an affectionate squeeze. "It was all my fault." "No such thing," declared Joel sturdily. "If you say so again, I'll fight you." "And perhaps you can straighten that lace," suggested Percy, with no relish for any further hostilities. Van and Joel drew off to the foot of the bed, huddled up there to regard his efforts, as he ran around the pillows, patting and smoothing them straight. "That won't do any good," said Joel, in great disfavor. "You can't make the lace whole again." Van sorrowfully embraced his knees, his feet tucked up under him. "Oh, what will Jane say?" he breathed fearfully. "Jane! I don't care for her," said Joel scornfully. "It's Mamsie," and he swallowed hard. "Perhaps she won't care," cried Van, leaving his knees to take care of themselves, in alarm lest Joel was going off again. "And just see how you've mussed up the bedspread," Percy couldn't help saying, to relieve his chagrin over the failure to make the pillow shams look nicely. And he drew off and pointed to it tragically. "It looks as if crocodiles had been all over it," he declared, hunting for the worst thing he could think of. Joel and Van rolled fearful eyes all over the bed. "I'm going to Mamsie," was all Joel said, as he rolled over the edge and disappeared from the room. "Oh, wait!" screamed Van. Then he rolled off his side of the bed, took 2 big steps, and stood quite still in the middle of the floor. "You've got to go with him and help tell," said Percy pleasantly, as if proposing the most delightful thing, but Van didn't stir. "Aren't you ashamed?" cried Percy with a sniff. "I'd like to know if Polly will think it's nice for you to sneak out of it, Van Whitney." "Oh!" squealed Van. He shot out into the hall, and without giving himself time to think, ran as hard as he could to join Joel in Mother Fisher's room. Left to himself, Percy set himself to work on straightening the bedspread, running around from one side to the other to pat and twitch impatiently. "As soon as I get one side nice, it all comes away from the other," he said to himself. "How in the world does Jane ever make a bed, I wonder?" And at last he deserted it altogether, and drew off with a very hot face. "Hi ho! I wish we could do something to celebrate when Rachel comes," and he wrinkled his brows in perplexity. "Oh, I know!" and he clapped his hands in glee. Then he ran softly out and up to Ben's room. But Ben wasn't in, so Percy, nearly bursting with the plan that now seemed to him very grand, was obliged to take someone else into his confidence. And that one happened to be old Mr. King, whom he met as he came downstairs with a very rueful countenance. "What's the matter, Percy?" asked the old gentleman with a keen glance. "Nothing, Grandpapa," said Percy dismally. "Goodness me! Do you carry about such a face as that for nothing?" cried the old gentleman with a laugh. "You look as if you'd something on your mind, my boy." "Well, I have, Grandpapa," said Percy, now driven into a corner, and looking up at last. "Best have it out then," said Grandpapa firmly, taking one of Percy's hands, and then they went on to the writing room. "There now, here is just the place for a boy to get things that are unpleasant off his mind, I take it," he said, closing the door on them both. "Sit down and tell me what is troubling you, Percy." "Can I stand up, Grandpapa?" asked Percy, over by the table. "To be sure," laughed Grandpapa. "Stand up or sit down, just as you choose. Only let us get at this bugaboo that is worrying you, my boy. Out with it." "It isn't a bugaboo," said Percy, with open eyes. "It's a plan, Grandpapa, only I can't find Ben." And he began to be dismal once more. "Dear me, where can he be?" "Oh, it's a plan, is it?" said Grandpapa, vastly relieved. "Well, well." Then he began to laugh. "And so you wanted Ben to help you with it, eh?" Yes, Grandpapa, said Percy, his happiness returning, and he deserted the table and ran up to the old gentleman's side. You see, Rachel is coming. Yes, she is, said old Mr. King with a satisfied nod. And you like it, I hope, my boy. He looked up with a keen glance. Awfully, said Percy, great satisfaction settling over his face. Well, I think all of us like the plan, remarked the old gentleman, in extreme complacency at achieving the visit, for she's a very nice girl, Rachel is, it appears to me. She's awfully good fun, said Percy, only Joel will make her play with him all the time, I suppose, and his face fell. Oh, you must cut Joe out, said old Mr. King, laughing heartily. I can't, said Percy dismally. We can't any of us, Grandpapa, and he opened his blue eyes very wide at the mere thought. Well, yes, I think we are all pleased, very much pleased indeed that Rachel is coming, repeated old Mr. King, going back to the expected visit. And as she comes tomorrow. Tomorrow, echoed Percy, aghast. Why, then I can't get up my surprise, Grandpapa, for strange to say, the time of the arrival had slipped from his mind. The old gentleman hastened to comfort him. Suppose you tell me the grand plan, he said at last. Then we'll see if there won't be time enough. Oh, I was going to get Ben to take me out into the woods tomorrow, said Percy, feeling as if he should very much like to cry, he was so disappointed. And we could have dug up some cunning little plants and ferns. Rachel said she liked them at the garden party. We could have planted them in a box, and 'twould have been so nice, and now it's too late. And overcome with despair, he sat down on the first thing he could find, which was a pile of books on the floor. Take care, warned Grandpapa, but over Percy had gone, the books flying all ways under him. I'll pick them up, he cried, when he could get his breath. I am glad you are not hurt, said Grandpapa King, with a rueful glance at the big reference volumes, only laid out for his use that morning, which certainly wouldn't be improved by their fall. Here, wait a bit, and I'll help you, Percy, my boy, and he got out of his chair. Oh, I can do it. Let me, Grandpapa. Let me do it alone, begged Percy, tugging at the books and piling as rapidly as he could, for they were quite heavy. There, see, they're almost back again, as he staggered up with the last one. Not quite so fast, said Grandpapa King, lending his hand to the task. Now, next time when you want to sit down, I advise you to take a chair, Percy, my boy. Well, now, let us think how you can get up a nice little surprise for Rachel when she comes tomorrow. And nobody must know it, cried Percy, quite enchanted at the prospect of having a secret plan with Grandpapa. Oh, you won't tell anybody but me, will you? He crowded in between the old gentleman's chair and the big table, and regarded him anxiously. No, indeed, cried old Mr. King in his most emphatic way, and bringing his hand heavily down on the table. Not a single person shall hear about it. This is your and my secret, Percy, my boy. And outside, in a slope of the terrace, where it ran down to a tangle of greenery, were Phronsie and little Dick, and they were making great preparations, too, for Rachel's visit on the following day. The great task before them was nothing more nor less than to set up their little stone house in the boulders under the big apple tree. I'm going to set up the cupboard, announced little Dick. Wait for me, do, begged Phronsie, who was busy in putting the little acorn cups and saucers in fine array on the big flat stone that served them as a table. Well, do hurry then, said Dick, his fingers twitching to be at their work, for it's just full of everything. He had pulled out the stone from a hole between the boulders, which, running in quite deeply, had served as a convenient receptacle for certain treasures and accumulations, and was therefore called the cupboard. We haven't cleaned it out in ever and ever so long, Phronsie. Yes, I will hurry, said Phronsie, gently putting the little acorn she held back into its cup. She had a soft little bit of cloth in her hand, with which she first wiped each piece. I'm almost through. I haven't but 11 more to do. Oh, I'll help you, cried Dick. Wash up the dishes. And he turned his back on the cupboard. Where's another towel? You mustn't break them, said Phronsie gravely, handing him another small portion of cloth, because you see they're very nice dishes, and she went back to her own polishing. I won't break them, promised little Dick, beginning on an acorn saucer. Children, it was Polly's voice. Oh, where are you? They could hear her as she sped over the terrace. Down went the little dish towels, and over went all the cups and saucers, for Dickie's foot knocked off what Phronsie spared, as both the small housekeepers rushed tumultuously out. Oh, here we are, Polly, they cried. Well, you must come at once if you want to go down to Candace's, she announced, standing on the terrace top, her cheeks quite rosy for her run after them. Auntie is going to take Jasper and me down to get some things for Rachel. Do you want to go too? Didn't they? Polly laughed to see them clamber along the green bank, and she put out her hands and drew them up. I shall buy Rachel something, announced Phronsie, smoothing down her pink frock with great decision as they reached the top. And so shall I, cried little Dick, bobbing his head. I shall get her the very nicest thing that Candace has. "Well, now, children, we must hurry," said Polly, as they all ran along, "because you know we ought not to keep Auntie waiting. Now then, 1, 2, 3, and away!" She seized a small hand in each of her own, and away they sped. None too soon, for Jasper was just skipping down to meet them with the announcement that Sister Marian was getting into the carriage, and there on the steps was Mrs. Fisher, with Phronsie's hat in her hand. "Get in, young man," said Jasper, cramming Dick's cap on his head, and he bundled him in unceremoniously, then hopped after himself. "I'm going to buy my little girl something," announced Phronsie, looking back where Mamsie still stood upon the step. "Yes, yes," she said smilingly, as Thomas started up the horses. "Wait, wait!" cried Phronsie, in a tone of great distress, and she leaned out toward Mamsie. "What is it, child?" said Mrs. Fisher, and "Wait a bit, Thomas," called Jasper. "What's the matter, Phronsie?" asked Polly, leaning over from the opposite seat, where she was ensconced with Mrs. Whitney. "I want my little purse," said Phronsie, looking down at her empty hands, then up at her in grave reproach. "Oh, Phronsie, you can take some of my money," began Polly. "We needn't wait for that, need we, Mamsie?" she cried, wrinkling up her forehead impatiently. "I want my own little purse," said Phronsie decidedly. "Yes, Mamsie will get it," said Mrs. Fisher. "That is, if Mrs. Whitney can wait." She cast a glance over Polly into the pleasant face above. "Yes, indeed," said Mrs. Whitney, with a cheery smile. "I think Phronsie had much better have her own little purse." "And I want my own purse, too," declared little Dick, struggling to get down from the seat where he was wedged in with Jasper and Phronsie. "Mine is big like a man's," he added, with great importance. "Dear me!" Mrs. Whitney burst into a merry laugh. "Mrs. Fisher, do you think you could be troubled enough to get Dickie boy's purse, too?" she asked. "I don't find it any trouble," said Mrs. Fisher, with another laugh, "to get them both." So Phronsie's little purse, with the chain to hang on her arm, and Dick's bigger one that folded like a pocketbook, were both handed into the carriage. Thomas cracked the whip, and off they went to see Candace in her little shop on Temple Place. The next day but one, Rachel was visiting in the little stone house among the boulders. Phronsie had carefully explained how the reason that the cups and saucers were all on the ground, and the dish towels thrown carelessly aside, was that they had gone away with Auntie, who couldn't be kept waiting. "Well, let's wash 'em up now," said Rachel, flying for one of the diminutive dish towels. "I'm going to clean out the cupboard," declared little Dick, going back to his original purpose. "Let us do the cups and saucers first," said Phronsie, with gentle determination, setting down Clorinda on a stone seat next to Rachel's doll, and carefully smoothing out her dress. "No, I want to do the cupboard," persisted little Dick, with strange obstinacy, for he was generally quite willing to give up to Phronsie. "I tell you, Phronsie," broke in Rachel suddenly, "let's all set up the cupboard first, and then it will be ready to put the clean dishes into. That's the best way." "Oh, let us," said Phronsie, easily pleased, and giving a last pat to Rachel's doll. So she ran over to join the others, and getting down on her knees, she began to fumble within the little cupboard. Dick had already opened the door, which was accomplished by taking away the stone. "Now you take out one thing, Phronsie, and I'll take out the next," said little Dick, crowding up as close as he could get. "And then I'll take the things," said Rachel, sitting down a little distance off between the two, "as you hand 'em out, so we'll all clean out the cupboard. Hullo, what's this?" as Phronsie handed out the first article. "That's a top," said little Dick, looking back at her. "A top!" cried Rachel in derision. "Why, it won't spin, not a bit in this world." "It would before it was broken," said Phronsie, for Dick had his face pressed close to the door of the cupboard, while his brown fingers were prowling about its interior. "Dear me, why don't you throw it away?" cried Rachel. "An old broken thing like that is no good." "Oh, we wouldn't ever throw it away, Rachel," said Phronsie in alarm. "That's our dear top, and it used to spin beautifully," and she took it affectionately out of Rachel's hand. "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Rachel. "Well, what's the next thing?" as little Dick backed away from the cupboard. "What is it?" as he placed some article in her hand. "They're a pair of her doll's eyes," said little Dick. "Oh, misery me!" cried Rachel, tumbling backward, the pair of eyes in her hand. "Why don't you have 'em put back in your doll, Phronsie?" "Because these are broken," said Phronsie, hanging on to the top with one hand, while she reached out the other, "and Grandpapa took my child down and got her new eyes." "Well, what makes you save these?" said Rachel, sitting straight again. "They're no use, Phronsie, now they're broken. Throw them away, too." "No, no," protested Phronsie, holding the pair of eyes very closely in her warm little palm. "They were my child's. I'm going to keep them always." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Rachel faintly. "You'll never set up your cupboard if you're going to put everything back again the same as it was. Well, pull out the next thing, Phronsie. It's your turn." So Phronsie set her two treasures down in a niche in the big boulder, and leaned over the door of the cupboard. "I'm going clear back," she announced, running her fat little arm as far as it would go, to bring it out with something brown in the middle of her palm. "What is it?" asked Rachel curiously. "Whatever in all this world, Phronsie?" at the queer little wad in Phronsie's hand. "Oh, that?" said little Dick before Phronsie could answer. "That's what the squirrel gave us a long time ago, Rachel." "The squirrel gave you?" she cried. "I suppose it's a nut," she added carelessly. "No, 'tisn't a nut," said Phronsie, still keeping it in her hand and shaking her head decidedly. "And he was a naughty squirrel. He was in a bird's nest." "In a bird's nest? What do you mean? And how could you see him?" demanded Rachel, all three questions in one breath. "We looked up," said little Dick, throwing his head back to illustrate his speech, "and he was right there, pointing up to the highest branches of the apple tree, way up on top." "And the poor bird was screaming," said Phronsie, snuggling up to Rachel's side, but still not offering to give up the little green wad. "Poor little bird! She made a new house," she added sorrowfully. "And the naughty squirrel was pulling out all the things in her house," said little Dick, breaking in with gusto, "and flinging them down. And he threw us this. Show her, Phronsie." So Phronsie opened her hand and held it up, the little green wad in the center. "Oh, isn't it funny?" Rachel was going to say. Instead, she seized it, twitched it apart, and hopped up to her feet. Then, deserting the two children, ran like lightning up the green bank, two torn bits of paper fluttering in her hand. And not observing where she went, she ran directly into old Mr. King, taking a constitutional on the lawn. "Bless me, what is it?" he gasped, putting out a strong hand to save her from a fall. "It's the $10 bill," panted Rachel. "Don't you see?" waving it at him. End of chapter 28. End of Five Little Peppers and Their Friends by Margaret Sidney.